Good evening all and welcome. Happy Halloween. As per custom, tonight I have 100 new and untold ghost stories for your listening pleasure. So without further ado, get comfortable. Don't forget to download our companion app, Mort's Bedtime Stories, for even more stories, free on iOS and Android. And let the darkness take control. This happened to me about 2 months ago. I work in a retirement home doing activities. On this day, I was filling in at the healthcare center, which is basically hospice. I was in the day room reading stories to one of the ladies. Suddenly, she asks me who that woman was. While, to me, it looked like she was pointing across the room. I don't know, but I'd be happy to ask her so we can find out, I reply, thinking she was talking about one of the CNAs who was sitting across the room. No, the woman right next to you on your left. There was no one sitting next to me. She looks like you, but her hair's longer. She says she doesn't have a name, but she's very nice. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I must have given her a look. Did I say something wrong? No, nothing wrong, I reply. I made a quick excuse to leave and practically ran back to my memory care unit. Now here's what shook me up. I was supposed to be an identical twin, but my twin died while we were still in the womb, leaving only me. This is not information I share with people I work with, let alone most people. One of the CNAs knew from looking at me that something had happened and wanted to know what it was. She was equally horrified when I shared this story. When I was 11, my cousins came to stay over, and they brought a Ouija board with them. We tried it, and a spirit called George responded. I was sure that it was my cousin messing with me, so I stopped playing and went back to bed. But that night when I was sleeping, I heard a sound, so I opened my eyes and saw that my door was opened, and a man was standing in the doorway. He then lit a matchstick and brought it closer to its face. I was so scared that I couldn't even make a noise or move a muscle. After a few seconds, the light from the matchstick slowly dimmed, as did the man. I ran from my room to my parents' room, and when I told them what happened, they came to my room to check, and they found an unlit matchstick. The next day when I talked to my cousins, they swear that they were not pranking me with the Ouija. Years later, I asked them and they still say they didn't. I like to believe it was a hallucination or sleep paralysis, but I still sleep with a small light on and can't explain away the physical evidence that we found. Marshville, North Carolina, 2008. My then girlfriend lived in a very secluded and rural area, and I lived about 45 minutes away. I drove country roads as much as I do to avoid highways, less traffic and lights, etc. And this was a daily drive for almost 2 years. I always took the same road, and I knew every inch of it by heart. It was mostly a straight stretch of road, except one area where it banked right up a hill. And as soon as it crested, it banked back downhill left. There were very few houses along the way, with lots of tree groves, so it was quite dark. Never once had I encountered anything out of the ordinary. There was rarely even other vehicles traveling. The most sign of life I ever saw was an occasional deer in the distance. However, one late summer evening I was heading home around 2 a.m., cruising at around 40 miles an hour down that same road. I got to the hill, made it the first bank to the stop, and turned into a down bank when I saw it. A humanoid shape cloaked in shadow. No discerning features, and oddly my headlights barely illuminated it. This thing was just floating there, resembling how ink spreads through water. This was all I could make out before I realized I wouldn't be able to stop in time to avoid it. I white-knuckled the steering wheel, clenched my jaw and squinted my eyes, as I had no idea what it was I was about to mow down. At the moment my bumper would have collided with the solid matter, the black mass just dissipated away. Yet I felt an ice-cold rush through the center of my car. My dash lights failed, but the throttle jerked in a sudden burst of acceleration. I didn't even bother glancing in the rearview mirror. I was frozen in disbelief for what I had encountered. The dash lights flickered back on, and I took the first available turn to the bright lights of the highway. I sped into a gas station parking lot and pulled up under the pump overhanging, basking in the warm fluorescent glow and trying to slow my heart rate. I immediately called my girlfriend to tell her what happened, but didn't get an answer. I was relieved at first, thinking maybe my imagination had pulled one over on me and I hadn't actually seen anything at all, and it saved me from sounding like a raving lunatic to her. So I went into the station to buy some smokes, convinced myself the dark really does play tricks, and wrote off the mishap with my car as it was aged and flawed. But as I made my way back outside, my fears began to rekindle. From a distance I noticed something on the front bumper, and as I got closer I realized it was on the hood as well. It looked like frost. A wide strip of white frost across the center of the hood, grille and bumper. It was 78 Fahrenheit outside. There's no way that could be. Against my better judgment, I reached out to touch it. It was definitely cold, but more odd than that, it was slimy. It melted into a goo-like substance as I felt it, and it stuck to my fingertips as I pulled my hand away. I stood there for a few minutes and watched as it melted, congealed, and then slowly dripped down and off the car. I have no idea what any of it was, and for a long time I told myself that it didn't happen, and I kept it to myself and made up strange excuses to my girl and friends why I wouldn't drive the road anymore after midnight. A few years went by until one night I was drinking with a close friend and decided it was time to spill the story. He explained to me that him and his family had lived in the area for years, and while what I experienced was shocking, it didn't surprise him in the least. He told me his parents and grandparents had shared similar stories, and they always just said, "Old Scratch was out tonight." Back in the late 70s, my dad's best friend suddenly died of a heart attack. They had a normal funeral service and a wake. The process usually takes about 3 days, ending at the burial in the cemetery. This is where my story and my dad's story begins. The day of the burial, it was a very nice sunny day, a bit warm for that time of year in my area. It was early April springtime. That afternoon the weather began changing. It heated up into the mid-80s and got very humid. I went to bed at the usual time that night, only to be awoken by a major thunderstorm at 3 a.m. I mean, it was a wicked storm. I needed to use the bathroom, so I did, and as I was settling back into bed I heard the house phone ringing. Now, who in the world could be calling us this early? My parents had a phone line in their room, and my dad answered it. There was no activity after that, so I figured it was a wrong number situation and headed back to sleep. The next morning I woke up and came down for breakfast, and I saw my dad at the table drinking coffee. He looked like he'd had a terrible night's sleep. I went about grabbing some cereal and asked who had called him in the middle of the storm last night. He just stared at me, looking pale, and asks if I heard the phone ring. I told him about my trip to the bathroom. There was silence from my dad's part, so I asked my mum, but she just said, "Your father answered the phone. He'll have to tell you." My dad sighed and told me he was asleep when the storm didn't wake him. When he answered it, the voice on the other end of the receiver was his newly buried best friend telling him to get to the cemetery quickly and to bring shovels and that they'd buried him alive. He kept repeating for him to hurry. There wasn't much time left. He then told me every old childhood fear he had ever felt came flooding into his head, and he was frozen with fear. He was deathly afraid his friend would come out of the closet in his room, as if he were walking past it at that moment. Crazy, right? Validated and made more real by me hearing the phone ring that night. He thought it was just a dream. I live in an apartment opposite a park in Japan. On the other side of the park was a convenience store, and the quickest way to access it was through the park. The park was pretty bare. It had a baseball field, a playground, and a path leading through it, with some mounds, some small plants, and thin trees. Not the most beautiful place. One summer evening, I'm heading to this store to get cigarettes, when I notice a lady standing to the side of the path, just staring at some houses. I get closer and greet her with a good evening in Japanese. She doesn't say anything to me, but I think nothing of it. She's probably afraid of a foreign man alone in the park at night. She's about 5 meters off the path, just standing there still. I look at her as I pass, and she has this distressed look on her face, still intently staring at the house across the street. I don't really know what to do. I looked at the houses, then back at her, then decided to just mind my own business and push on. I took about 5 to 10 more steps, then just came to a halt. Something wasn't right. Everything about her just seemed off. I turned around and she was gone. There were no trees thick enough to hide behind, no bushes or large rocks to hide behind, no buildings, no bins. Had she ran there wasn't enough time to be out of sight. I also would have heard her running on a gravel dirt path. She vanished in the space of seconds. I walked around for a few minutes looking for her, thinking this could have been a prank, but she was nowhere. The whole atmosphere of the park changed for a moment. The air felt heavy, like I was being watched, so I pressed onto the store and took the long route home. About 3 months later, I was smoking on my balcony one night when I saw her again. Same part of the park, same stance, staring at the same house. And again, she disappeared in an instant, the moment I took my eyes off her. I once saw a homeless man walking toe-to-toe on the curb on a busy street. He had a truck coming and bolted right in front of it. I saw the truck slam on its brakes to avoid hitting the guy, but it wasn't possible, because the truck was speeding. I looked away briefly because I didn't want to see the guy on the pavement and grabbed my phone to call 911. The guy wasn't on the pavement. He also wasn't on this side of the street. He was gone. This was in broad daylight at 4 p.m. in the middle of summer. The homeless guy looked like a solid body, and there wasn't anything ghostly or shadowy about him. He looked like a real human being. And yet, me and the truck driver both saw him, and then he vanished. When I was younger, my parents used to host family gatherings around the holidays. It was all sorts of extended family, as well as the immediate family. It wasn't really uncommon for people that I'd never met to show up. When I was 6 or 7, I remember noticing this guy for the first time. He looked like he was pretty close to my dad's age, which would have made him close to the 50s or 50-something. He was pretty short, kind of stocky, and had these thick, framed 50s-style glasses. Even as a kid, I noticed this guy never seemed to engage with anyone. He kind of just ambled around and smiled, like he was taking everything in, appreciating the gathering. I remember being really comforted by his presence for some reason. He kept showing up after that from time to time, but I still don't remember him talking to anyone, though I do have a vague memory of him sitting with my dad and granddad on the couch while the two of them spoke and the guy smiled at me. Around the time I was 10, we stopped having these sort of gatherings because of some financial issues. I had kind of forgotten about the guy until I turned 18 and was getting ready to graduate high school. I asked my dad if he would mind inviting some of the extended family to graduation, and for some reason I brought up the guy. My dad looked puzzled and asked me who I meant. When I gave him a brief description, he turned white. He grabbed the photo album and showed me a picture, and asked me if this was the man I was referring to. Yeah, that's him. My dad began freaking out. You see, the picture was of my great-grandfather, who died in the mid-60s. I don't know exactly what happened, but my parents and grandparents are convinced I saw his ghost coming to visit to check up on the family. I'm not really a believer in the supernatural, but I don't have a solid excuse for this story, unless I maybe dreamt parts of it, which is unlikely, as I recognized the face. The house my parents live in is fairly old, built in the 1950s. Renovated and updated in the 70s and not much done to it since. It's not creepy, but it's not the most comfortable. The insulation sucks, it's freezing inside in winter, and the water pressure is crap. So it doesn't give you the creeps, but it's not generally where I want to be. They moved in when I was 17, so 13 years ago. When I was 19, I was home alone vacuuming in the living room. It was late afternoon or early evening, about 5 p.m, and my parents were not yet home from work, and my brother was at his girlfriend's house. I was home alone. Because of this, I had every door locked. Again, it was a very old home, so we never bothered opening the windows, as they were old and creaky if you opened them. You'd need somebody to go outside and push on the windows, as the panes cranked open as they're not slide-up windows, to get it closed flush again. So my point is, I'm inside alone, and the house is locked up tight. I'm vacuuming in the living room with my earbuds in my ears and not really paying attention, just doing my chores automatically like I do every day. The doorway to the kitchen is to the right when I suddenly get the feeling that I'm being watched, and my senses heighten. Then I realize there's someone standing in the kitchen doorway. I jump, practically throw the vacuum, shriek and yell out my earbuds, "Who are you? What do you want?" It's an older man, thinning hair on top, dressed in clothes that looks to be from the 70s. He doesn't react at all to my antics, doesn't even blink when I jumped or screamed. He's looking at me, not angry, but almost confused and sad. He looks puzzled and sad, and without a word he turns around in the doorway and walks off to the right towards the back door in the kitchen. I'm shaking and scared, and grab something heavy, I think it was one of my stepdad's sports decor pieces, and tiptoe towards the kitchen. I hadn't heard a single sound since I asked who he was, not a footstep, which wasn't possible as the kitchen floor is creaky as hell. I get to the kitchen doorway and peer around, then look towards the back door. The kitchen is empty. The back door is still bolted and locked. I open the one other door in the kitchen, the one leading to a bathroom that's connected to the den. He's in neither. And the door of the den is locked from the inside like it always is. And it can't be locked while the door is open and then closed again. You have to lock it from inside and turn around and go out through the bathroom and come out through the kitchen. I checked the whole house. I unlocked the back door and go check the backyard, the side of the house, the gate. All is empty, and all is still locked. But here's the thing. The man, he was a dead ringer for the description we were given about the man who first bought the house back in the 50s, and who subsequently died in the same house in the 70s. When I was 10, I spent a lot of time at my friend's house. It was an older townhome built in the 1800s, and pretty much every door had those old knobs with skeleton lock keys. All of the original keys had been lost as far as we knew, and we never cared for them. We were playing hide and seek one night during a sleepover, and I hid in the basement behind the old water heater. This is a small cubby space beside the stairs, and we used to spend a lot of time in that space because unfortunately her mother was an alcoholic and would get into violent fights with her boyfriend while we were home. It was our favourite hiding space, and while I sat back there waiting to be found, I saw something poking out from under a piece of broken wall panelling and pulled it out. It was an old skeleton key. We stopped our game and immediately set out to find what it unlocked. It didn't work on any of the doors in the house, so we tucked it away into her trinket box and went to bed. That night neither of us slept well. We both had nightmares, and she swore up and down she saw someone sitting in her rocking chair when she woke up in the middle of the night. The house was haunted as hell. I have tons of stories from that place, but things seemed completely different that night. We were dumb kids, so we kept the key for a few weeks. She continued to have a lot of sleepless nights and nightmares during that time. I had them too if I stayed over, but when I was home I was perfectly fine. I can't remember how we decided on it, but one evening, while we were good and alone, we decided to set the key on the bottom of the stairs and go to the attic as bait. We were going to close the door and open it really fast to try and get a picture of a ghost. She was convinced the ghost saw her in her room, lived in the attic, and we were dumb 10-year-olds, so why not try it? We opened the door and set the key down. She took a control picture of the key sitting on the step as we closed the door. When we tried to open it again, it would not open. Both of us pulled on the door with all of our little kid strength, but it wouldn't budge. This went on for a few minutes, no clue how long, before the door finally opened. The key was completely gone. We searched the stairs for almost an hour before we finally gave up. That night we slept like babies. All her nightmares went away, and she never mentioned seeing anything in her rocking chair again. As adults, we both rationalized the other was pushing the door shut to scare us, and the one of us had actually hidden away the key. We talked about it after we'd both graduated high school and were shocked to be told that no, it wasn't a prank neither of us had pulled. We still have no idea what happened that day, and we truly never saw the key again. I worked for a college in Oregon when I was younger and had to leave at 10 p.m. After all the classes had ended, I was there for IT. Per the usual, I got into my car and headed home. It was pitch black because of the trees and underbrush. I drove up Highway 20, vibing and listening to music, but noticed something walking along the guardrail up a hill. I've had run-ins with deer, so I immediately felt jumpy because my lawnmower of a car would be obliterated by hitting even a possum. I focused on the walking figure and saw it was a homeless person, which is very common here in Oregon, especially on the coast. He was quite a way up the hill, so I thought I'd have time to just go around him. He wore white shoes and a red plaid top with a hat on. I thought, what the hell is he doing out here in the middle of nowhere on Highway 20? I finished that thought, and the man immediately darted in front of my car. I'm doing 65 miles an hour and have literally no time to stop. I turned into the oncoming lane as this guy was obviously trying to commit suicide by car. I saw his white shoes in my headlights, and for a split second, he went from fully visible to the darkest shadow I've ever seen. High beams did not pass through him. I swerved and ended up sideways on the highway, having hit whoever it was. They landed on the hood of my car, with both hands sprawled out. The man stared at me, and the primal fear I felt was something I can never describe in words. The void of black that this figure was made absolutely no sense. Couple that with the thought that I'd just killed someone. Then he vanished like smoke in the air. Gone. I sat there dumbfounded, unable to breathe. I was so scared. I felt like I had to get out of there and sped up the hill. And I called my husband, screaming in terror because I just hit someone who wasn't there. I got home and there were no handprints on my car, no dents. It's like nothing happened. I couldn't sleep that night and couldn't go that route home for a while. It really made me question my sanity. I still don't know what it was or who it was. I checked on deaths on that stretch of road out of curiosity a week later and found a guy had rolled his truck, killing his family and himself. I looked him up on Facebook, and his profile picture was of him wearing a red plaid shirt and a hat. And you know what's even stranger? There's a mold-covered child's rabbit stuffed animal tied to the guardrail where I experienced this. When I was a kid, we lived in a house my dad built out in the country. This is important because I was there when we poured the foundation, built the structure and finished the inside. No one had lived there before us. There were no previous houses on the property. It was literally a field in the middle of nowhere that my dad thought would be fun to live on. There was a lot of spooky stuff that happened within the house. I saw shadows all the time. One night I heard all of the dishes in our cabinets fall and shatter, and when I woke up the next morning there was nothing wrong with all of the cabinets, and the dishes were fine. Then when I was around 8 or 9, I was playing in my room and I went to get some toys from my closet. I opened the door, and just inside the closet was a woman standing there in perhaps Victorian-style white, high-necked lake dress with her brown hair pulled into a bun. She was tall and thin, and the most severe, cold look I had ever seen was given to me by her. I stumbled back out and ran into my bedroom crying. I grabbed my parents and brought them to my room to make them see the scary lady in white, but when we got back she was gone. The image of this woman is still burned into my brain. Fast forward 15 years and the house has been sold to a family friend of ours. The family friend has 3 small kids, and one of them started having nightmares. The friend remembered me saying there were a lot of scary things that happened there when I was a kid, and growing up in the 90s, all I could think of was perhaps it was an Indian burial ground. The family friend called me one day and asked if I remembered anything about a woman in my bedroom while I was growing up. I told her about the woman in the closet. Her high-neck dress, the dark hair in a bun. She told me she got chills because I was perfectly describing the woman who kept showing up in her daughter's nightmares. As an adult, I finally asked my dad if there was any weird history about the property before we lived there. He told me the land we bought was the site of a Comanche raid on a family that was trying to settle there in the 1800s. The whole family had been chased down by Native Americans on horseback and murdered. The actual name of our street was named after the incident, which I never realized because I thought it was describing an animal or acting naturally, but was actually the last name of the family who tried to escape and failed. My grandma's sister, or great-aunt, married my great-uncle and moved to another city, about an hour or 2 away from where me and my grandparents lived. We would come over all the time and spend weekends at their house. They had a huge, beautiful home with many rooms, a huge yard, dogs, a swimming pool, and some awesome weather. Much better than our city. During this visit, I grew very close to my great-uncle. We had similar interests, and he thought I was a very smart kid. On my part, I was fascinated by him. He was smart, cultured, educated, and I wanted to learn. Mind you, I was like 2 to 4. Usually after lunch, we get some downtime, like a nap. Adults might go lay down in bed or in hammocks, and they had an awesome swimming pool, but during this time we were not allowed to swim there because no one could watch us. During this time, my great-uncle would go into his studio to read or look at his collection of many books, maritime equipment, crocodiles, etc. And one time I decided to follow him to see his collection and just to hear him talk. Eventually it became a habit. He did not like this downtime and neither did I. It was boring, but we would always keep ourselves busy in our own way. One time when we were at his house, I went into his studio for a chat like I always did. Apparently our chat was longer than usual because I was missing for a long time. Eventually everyone was looking for me. I was 4 and it was a big house. When I heard people screaming my name, I had to end the chat to go look for my mum so she wouldn't worry, but I told him I'd be back. When I got out of the studio into the terrace, everyone was concerned and asking where I was. I was super chill, like talking to great-uncle like I always do. Everyone was shocked, because apparently he'd passed away a month ago. In 2011, I moved to London to study. I missed out on the limited spaces in the halls of residence, but was able to find a house share not too far. It was an old house built in the 40s, but it was warm and I lived with 4 others who, like me, could not get into student halls. One night I awoke around 3:30 AM to a very cold room. When I say I woke up, I mean I was completely alert and awake. The strange thing is, the heat was not on yet in the room. It was incredibly cold. I had the sense of feeling of being watched, and as I turned to look into the corner of the room, I saw a dark, thin, shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room, and it horrified me. This had never happened before. I was looking at the tall, dark figure, staring right at me, and it felt evil. I stared back, petrified to move at first, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. I switched on my bedroom light, and as fast as the light came on, the figure vanished. The only thing in the corner of the room was my study desk. No clothing or tall object that could make out the shape that stood before me. I'm not religious, but from that day on in my house I made sure to have a crucifix and symbol to ward off any evil in my room. I tried to talk about it with my housemates, and every time I did, my eyes would water up and I could barely get the words out, until I moved out of that house after I finished my first year. 11 years on, I still feel haunted about what happened that night. I make sure to carry a symbol of protection with me and practice my own rituals to keep evil away. Because who knows, I may have another visitor. When I was 11, my family went on holiday to a 300-year-old maison in France. We stayed on what used to be the stables, but has since been converted. Parts of the house had been damaged by a fire in the early 1900s and subsequently had chunks of it off-limits to guests. I woke up one night in the dead of night, desperately needing to use the bathroom while everyone else was fast asleep, so I scurried to it. Now the bathroom was at the end of a long corridor, with a view straight down to the kitchen, maybe 8 to 10 meters. I do my business, stand up, wash my hands, and the basin I'm facing is at a 90-degree angle to the kitchen, and because I'm a kid and it's dark, I'm naturally freaking out in my head. I turn up to look at the corridor in the kitchen, and lo and behold, there's a man there, going about his business dressed in clothes from the 1800s. He didn't look at me, acknowledge me, and just walked from the right-hand side of the kitchen to the left, and then he was gone. I crapped my pants and crawled back to bed, stuck my head under the covers and did not get back to sleep. It was years later that I was talking to my parents about the holidays we used to take when we were younger. I was telling them about this, and I assumed it had probably been my imagination. My mum went pale and asked, "Did that really happen?" I said to the best of my knowledge, with no hyperbole around what I said. Turns out she too had heard loads of weird stuff happen and seen things in that house, but decided not to tell us kids in order not to freak us out. As a child, I had an imaginary friend, who I would only ever see at my cottage. This friend didn't speak and was very pale. One day he asked me if I wanted to meet his family, and if I wanted to go home with him. Again, he never really spoke, but he conveyed this wish to me. I was very excited since I didn't know where he lived and had never met his family. So off we went further into the woods until we reached a place where a woman wearing white was standing, and my friend indicated to me that I should follow them. It was at that moment I heard my mother calling me. I told my friend I had to leave, but that I would be right back, and he got very upset, insisting I go with him and return. My mother called me again, and I apologized to my friend, who at this point was the saddest I'd ever seen him. I ran home to the cottage where my mum was busy weeding, and I asked my mum why she'd called me, and she informed me that she had not called me at all. I ran back to the spot I last saw my friend, but he wasn't there, nor was he in any of our usual spots. He just disappeared, and I never saw him again. The whole experience was strange, but I just want to know who called me that day while I was in the woods. My dad has been dead for over 20 years. He was a heavy smoker. I, on the other hand, don't smoke. Well, about 10 years ago, I was driving home along a village road that came to a T-junction on a blind bend. And while I usually drive very carefully, that day I had a lot on my mind and honestly wasn't concentrating. I suddenly realized I was approaching the junction far too fast, so I slammed my foot on the brake to find the pedal was already halfway down. At the same moment, the car was filled with the smell of cigarette smoke. I was able to stop safely, and as I did, I heard his voice in my head say, "Now concentrate, you daft bat," which is exactly the sort of thing he would have said. Thanks, Dad. I still miss you. This all started when I was around 8 years old. I remember seeing a tall man with a flat cap and a briefcase. His body had black particles coming off him. At the time, I had a cabin bed, like a bunk bed, but it had a desk and wardrobe underneath, and he would walk from my door to my bed and walk through. One time he spoke to me as he did this. I asked him, "Where are you going?" And he replied, "Work," in this demented voice. He never came back after that day. After 6 years, I did some research into my home. It was built in 1901 as homes for people who worked in the factory opposite. I've seen many ghosts, but that one encounter finally came together after many years. I was driving one night down an old road. As I approached a 4-way stop sign at the end of it, I could see a shape of another car right in front of me. Instead of going through the stop sign, it turned sharply to the right and went off the road. I heard a huge crashing sound, so I stopped and ran out of my car. It was after midnight and there weren't any other cars on the road. I ran down past the communal mailbox that the car barreled past and down towards the ditch in the direction I saw it go. The only thing I saw was a memorial for the crash that happened 2 years ago. I spent 5 minutes or so searching and shouting and found nothing else. The tour company I worked for did 3 separate tours, at 8 PM, 10 PM, and a ghost hunt. We never got much activity during the 8 PM tour, but the 10 PM tour could be super active. One of the first stops was at Bruton Parish Church. It's the oldest active church on the East Coast. On a 10 PM tour, my group had just gotten to the stop when a light started circling the bell tower. It kept circling for a solid 5 minutes, almost like it was dancing, then vanished. Near the church is the George Wythe house. Out in front of the house is a cement block that people used to step down from carriages back in the day. I'm very short and I would stand on it while I told the ghost stories to keep an eye on everyone and actually make eye contact. As I was standing on it, a strange feeling came over me. It was windy out and I could see it blowing in the trees, but I couldn't feel it. Everything sounded like I was in a glass box. A guest bought their EMF detector near me and it lit up like crazy. This went on for about a minute or so, or at least that's what it felt like. On a few occasions I've seen a Native American boy running through the Williams and Mary campus. One of the administrative buildings had been a school for Native children. A male spirit at the Peyton Randolph house called me a rude word, and I've also been threatened by spirits at the jail and even grabbed. If you stay late enough, you may even see shadow figures walking down the streets in and out of the shops as though they're going about their daily lives. This was around 2 years ago. I had a summer job in a greenhouse, which started at around 5 or 6 AM, because by 11 the greenhouse was unworkable because of the heat. I live in a town with about 20,000 people, so it's modern but has old-fashioned elderly. This is important. When I woke up, I felt very awake and was not tired whatsoever. When I was biking to work, I saw an interesting figure biking towards me in the distance. She was on a cargo bike, basically a wheelbarrow on the front of the bike. The cargo part of the cargo bike was made of wood and looked old. She was wearing old-fashioned clothes, which I saw sometimes, but it was rare, especially at 6:30 AM, so she caught my attention. Once she got closer, I saw her face, or what should have been. They had old grey hair, red and white headcloth and an old jacket on, had very pale skin but no face, just skin on her head. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, and just kept on going. I looked at her for a full 5 seconds close up and she never acknowledged me. It scared the crap out of me, and no one ever believed me. I grew up in a house that you might call infested by ghosts. I saw them and tried speaking to them regularly. No one else in my family spoke to them. I'm not even sure if they saw them. But they all knew the ghosts existed. Most of them were friendly, but a few were not. I was never scared though. There was an old man with a lantern and pocket watch that kept all the spirits in the house in check. But probably the scariest thing to happen to me was when my mother had a priest bless the house and a witch purify it with sage on the same day. All of a sudden, the phantoms were gone. I was about 7 or 8 at the time. It really shook me that they would all leave just like that. When I was 7, a year after my dad passed away, I woke up in the middle of the night and sat up in bed. I looked outside my room towards the staircase and saw the perfect shadow of a man, even though it was completely pitch black in the house. I cried myself to sleep and woke up a short time later and the shadow was gone. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check on my mum. She had double doors in her room that were cracked. I peeked in, clear as day, and saw the shadowy figure walking around my mum's bed, and then it leaned over my mum from the other side of the bed. I shined the light at my feet, and the figure shot up, turned and walked into the bathroom. I told my mum and sister the next day, and had both of them freaked out for a while. I'm 30 now and I can still remember it very vividly, and I don't really think I was imagining it. I haven't had any paranormal experiences since. I think my dad just had to say goodbye. One last time. This happened to me on October 1st. I was having a rough week, as was my best friend, so we opted to do one of our favourite activities, driving through the city, windows down, listening to loud music. It was just what the doctor ordered. We were fawning all over the Halloween decorations that were up when we got to the sketchier block. To explain, this stretch has no streetlights. On our left is about a quarter-mile long fence which circles a cemetery, and ahead of that is an old but large Catholic cathedral. On our right, a field with two neighbourhood entrances that are very spaced out from each other. The houses start a good distance from each turn-in. There are no other cars on the road. We see, coming seemingly out of thin air, a child of maybe 7 years old, running at a moderate pace along the fence line away from the church. He has no shirt or shoes, long hair, light jeans, pale skin, so even in the dark is easy to spot. It was 67 degrees out, wet from raining earlier that evening, so he was very underdressed. My friend pops a U-turn, as there were no other cars on the road, and in that 1.5 seconds it takes for us to turn, the child has vanished. The fence is made of metal spiked poles too close together for a child to squeeze through, and too tall for him to have scaled it, not to mention they were wet. He definitely couldn't have crossed 4 lanes in that time, let alone go through the field space to turn in for the neighbourhood. We were close to the church up ahead, in our original direction, so it would have been only a quarter of a mile to the closest intersection the way he was running. We watched him run as we turned, and only looked away for a split second, but it looked like he had just come in and out of thin air. To cover our bases, we circled around a few times. The neighbourhoods were dark, aside from a couple of string lights, but no one was out. No sign of this little boy anywhere. We just came to the conclusion that it must have been a ghost, as that was the most logical conclusion, unless he fell down a kid-sized hole or could fly or jump super high, of course. I was 10 and spending the night at my grandma's house. My aunt dropped my younger cousins over too. They were 4 and 5. I woke up around 2 a.m. or so and was super thirsty, so I decided to go downstairs to get some water. 10-year-old me was scared as hell to go downstairs, so I lit up downstairs like it was Christmas holiday. As I turn around to stop drinking water, I see some super white ethereal-looking kid laugh and walk down the hallway leading through the garage and walking through the garage door. At that moment I said screw this, turned off the light and went upstairs, locked my door and went to sleep. I asked my grandma if my cousin had woken up during the night, thinking maybe what I saw was just me, tired, and my cousins running around. She told me that my aunt picked them up at midnight, so it was just me and my grandma, and my grandpa at the house after that hour. My 2 sisters had also seen something similar at my grandma's house. No one knows anything. I'm an atheist and still have no answer for what I saw that night, besides some dead spirit kids trespassing. Between 1993 and 4, I lived in a haunted house in Asheville, North Carolina. Just an ordinary 1960s ranch house, but there definitely was a ghost of an elderly man that lived and died there from Alzheimer's. When I was looking at the empty house to rent, I opened the closet at the end of a hallway and ran into a physical being. It felt exactly like running into a person. I jumped backwards and fell onto the floor. Yikes! After moving in, I would hear him as he shuffled up and down the hallway in his slippers that went flap, flap, flap as he paced. I had my sewing room in what used to be his bedroom, and I would hear him open the front door, walk down the hallway, turn the doorknob into the room, and the door would swing open. The front door had not, and no one was in the hallway. I never felt very threatened, but I do seem to have a heightened sense of awareness. He loved to use the music box we got as a wedding present. I would hear it being wound up on the shelf in the other bedroom, and it would play by itself. It always seemed to soothe him. My boyfriend and I got married while living in that house. Several of our out-of-town guests stayed with us. My boyfriend's brother and his wife stayed the night in the haunted room. I casually asked them the next morning how they slept. Andy said fine, but Anna said she had a weird dream that there was an old man standing over them and staring. I laughed and told her it was the ghost. She turned pale, and they were packing up and heading to a Hilton within 10 minutes. A friend of mine slept several nights in that room, and she had nothing happen to her. One of the guys worked with a newsroom in Asheville, North Carolina, and said that he stayed with his grandparents a lot when he was little. They had a 2-story house, but when he was 2 years old, they removed it. Forever after, you could always hear footsteps overhead, doors opening, rocking chairs squealing, despite the fact there was no second floor. Even a rooster would occasionally crow there that wasn't there either. My mum and I were chilling in the living room downstairs. We had just moved in, and at the time all of the bedrooms were upstairs. One bedroom is now down. I went to the bathroom, and I come back and my mum is absolutely shaken. I ask her what happens, and she goes, "I heard your dad say, 'Darling, come to bed,' in Urdu, and I heard him say it from the room behind us." Dad was sleeping upstairs that night. No one was in the room behind us. It was so realistic, and many other experiences happened after that left us all very weirded out and shaken. I used to live in a really crappy basement apartment, in an apartment building that was about 50 years old. It was in Coventry Road in Cleveland Heights. Coventry Road has been kind of outcast mecca, starting with the hippies in the 60s. It's full of quirky shops and people kind of just hanging out there. A friend of mine knocked at the door. As I stood up and started walking towards it, I got a case of full-body goosebumps. I look over to the other side of the room and saw a man wearing a flannel plaid shirt and bell bottoms. A full-ass man. I ran to the door and my friend was like, "Dude, are you okay? You look like you just seen a ghost." After digging into it, I learned my apartment building and the retail building next door caught fire in the 70s and a few people died. My apartment building was the very first apartment building next to the main shopping complex, which was burnt down, twice, supposedly for insurance money by the owner of the complex, who also owned my apartment building. When I was about 13 or so, I was alone in my house gaming on my PC. The house was 3 stories and you could look down from my computer area, story 3, towards the kitchen on the 2nd floor. At about 8 p.m. at night, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up and it felt eerily cold. I jolted and turned around thinking someone was right behind me and nothing was there. But there was this intense fear feeling I was getting. I actually left the house and ran to my friend's house a few streets away and hung out there until my parents returned. A few weeks later, I was talking to my mum. She asked me something that made my blood run cold. She was actually at a psychic reader's the night I was home alone. I don't believe in them, but she used to go to this woman a lot and has a lot of recordings of their sessions on tape. She said she told the woman she always felt very uneasy when she was in the kitchen, like someone was watching her. The woman said to her, "Yes, there's an old man in your house." Then she exclaimed, "Your son just saw him." My mum said it freaked her out, but I'm not sure why. It was only a few weeks later when she asked me about it. Maybe she thought I'd be like, "Whatever, weirdo," in my teenage way. I still sometimes think about it to this day, which is what makes me question supernatural things at times. I don't usually believe in them because I'm usually a logical thinker, but that was such a bizarre and creepy experience, I can't shake it from my head. I also remember never feeling safe being alone in that house after that as well. I used to close every door in the house, going forward, if I had to stay there by myself. When I was 13, I experienced the ghost of my grandmother. She died in her sleep while taking a nap on the living room couch. Afterwards, according to my father and grandfather, every now and then they could hear her make the trip from the bedroom to the kitchen and open the refrigerator door, a trip she made many times while being alive. At first, I thought my father and grandfather were making this up, having fun at my expense. A few years after she passed away, my father and I went to spend the weekend with my grandfather. My father and I slept on the living room couch, as it opened into a double bed, the very same couch my grandmother died on. My grandfather left the house to go next door to a neighbor's house to play poker. My father and I went to bed in the living room. My father went right to sleep, but I lay awake reading a magazine. After a while, I heard the noise of the back bedroom door being pulled open. I heard the sound of shuffling feet, and I heard the creak in the floor directly in front of the bathroom doorway. I heard more shuffling feet. Then I heard the fridge door being pulled open, and I heard the sound of glass bottles in the fridge, doors clinking against each other. Back then, they were still putting soft drinks in glass bottles, and feeling thirsty, I decided to get out of bed and go join my grandfather in the kitchen for a cold drink. But when I get to the kitchen, I find myself all alone. I was puzzled. I could have sworn I heard my grandfather walk from the bedroom to the kitchen and open the fridge. Then I remembered he wasn't home. He was over at the neighbor's and hadn't come back yet. And then the memory of the ghost story returned to me. I got scared, raced from the kitchen into the living room and leaped over my sleeping father into my side of the bed. Then I went to sleep. I don't know how long I slept for before I woke up with a start, feeling paralyzed with fear. I was frozen, laying on my right side, and it took a while for me to work up the courage to turn my head to the left. My head was covered by a blanket. There was a shadow being cast there. The shadow was the outline of a head and shoulders of a woman with a beehive hairdo. My grandmother used to always have a beehive hairdo, even years after it went out of style until she died. I heard heavy breathing coming from the shadow. I had to work up the courage to move one of my hands to remove the blanket from my face, and when I did, in an instant the paralyzing fear I felt was gone, as was the shadow and the sound of heavy breathing. My father was still sleeping. I pulled the blanket back over my head and went to sleep, only to wake up again on my right side, with the paralyzing fear back again. Forcing myself to turn my head, the shadow was back. The heavy breathing was back. I had to summon up all the courage to move my hand to take my blanket off my face, only to find nothing there and the paralyzing fear gone. I went through this same routine the entire night. I lost count of how many times this happened through the night, maybe a dozen, maybe more. The next morning I told my father what happened to me throughout the night while he slept. The sound of the bedroom door opening, the shuffling of feet, the fridge door, nobody in the kitchen being awoken by paralyzing fear, the shadow, the heavy breathing, and the repeat performances throughout the night. I kind of expected him to tell me I was just seeing and hearing things, but instead he smiled and just exclaimed, "That was Grandma." My late father was an Anglican priest and was appointed to a rural parish with a Victorian-era vicarage. My younger brother and sister, who were twins, shared a room on the top floor of the house, and one day my brother, who was maybe 4 years old at the time, was shoveling his breakfast into his mouth when he started telling us about the old lady he kept seeing next to his bed. Dad spoke to a man who was the local historian and told him that back in the days when priests were independently wealthy and had household staff, that bedroom had belonged to a housekeeper who had passed away in there. By the time my brother was 7, he couldn't remember the experience when asked about it, but it just bears out the memory that small children are more open to paranormal sightings because their minds haven't closed off yet. I was living in a small trailer on an Apache reservation in Arizona sometime in 2001. I woke up in the middle of the night to find a dark, shadowy figure staring at me from across the room. Part of me wanted to hide under my blanket, like a little kid. The other part of me said not to move. I just lay there watching it. After a short time it moved to the door, and disappeared. You could say it was the spookiest and most unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me. I moved to Mexico when I was 11. My dad built our house himself over the course of a few months, the first 2 of which we lived in my grandma's house. During that time, I had 2 unexplainable incidences. The first time I was in the living room with my sister watching TV around midnight, while everyone else was asleep. The front door leading into a short hallway that has a door on the right which leads into the living room. You cannot access the living room without first walking through that hallway, and there are lights that stay on all night in there. The door has glass panes that allow you to see into the hallway from the living room. Well, that night my sister and I saw a black figure walk by the door. It looked like a tall, stocky man, but only the silhouette was clear. Other than that, he was pitch black. No one in the house fit that description, and the front door was locked. No way some stranger walked in. My sister bolted it to the bedroom, and I sat there in shock for a few moments before I could get up and run too. When we mentioned it to some of our cousins a few days later, they said it was Grandpa. He passed just a year before we moved there, and apparently other people had seen his figure before. I saw him again about 2 weeks later, but I was alone that time, and I was just as scared as the first. The second incident I had, after my dad built the majority of our house and we moved in. For 3 years nothing strange ever occurred, until the summer of 2011 when I was 14. That summer I got hooked onto an online game and would stay up into the early hours of the morning playing. My parents didn't like that, so I had to sneak to the living room in order to use the computer. One rainy night I took advantage of the noise the rain was making to get up without being heard. I walked quietly to the living room after closing the kitchen door behind me, and I heard a loud, "Hey!" come from both sides of the living room at the same time. Everyone else was asleep. Regardless of the voice, it didn't sound familiar. It also sounded a bit like a whisper at the same time, but it was very loud. No person could physically whisper that loud. I froze in fear and after a few seconds managed to look around the living room. After seeing nothing, I opened the door behind me and ran back to my bed. I kept that story to myself as I didn't want to worry my brother or sister until more weird things started happening. On another occasion, the 3 of us were in the living room. My brother was using the computer, my sister laying on the couch, and I was sitting in a chair, as we were all facing the front wall of the house and had a clear view of a large window and the front door. It was night, but the lights were on in the living room, as well as out front. A black figure of a man ran by the window and the front door. We all jumped in our seats and looked at the window, and then the front door at the same time as we saw the thing run by. My brother switched off the PC, and we got out of there. Another notable incident was one night when the 3 of us were about to go to sleep. My sister had just gone to her room, and it was just my brother and I. We were about to turn the lights off and walk across the kitchen and go to the hallway. He was standing at the opposite end of the kitchen waiting for me, and as soon as I flipped the light switch off, I saw a tall black figure walk right by me out of the corner of my eye. I even felt the breeze from it passing my face. I immediately switched the lights back on and my brother and I were standing in the same spot. We were looking at each other with a confused look and asked at the same time, "Why did you walk past me?" We both knew damn well it was impossible, that quickly, to get that far away in 2 seconds. We gave each other this wide-eyed hell no look, and I turned the lights off and we both ran into our rooms. There were other less crazy incidences where we both each saw things on our own separate occasions. My sister brought all of this up with a friend of hers around the block who grew up here, and she told my sister that what we saw was El Perdido, which is the name the locals give to this thing because other people had already seen him years before us around the block. We haven't seen him since that summer, and I hope I never do, because I can't recall ever feeling such paralyzing fear before in my life. There was this one weekend where me and my family and some family friends went camping out in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. There is this one house there that is supposedly haunted, and may in fact be haunted after you hear what has happened. It's a tiny farmhouse with a few rooms on ground level and a few upstairs and an unfinished basement. We had just finished the tour and were given these stupid ghost sensors and were allowed to explore the house. So me and some friends got up with some people we met there and started exploring. We go upstairs first, search all the rooms, even go into the attic, but there's nothing. Absolutely nothing. So we finished upstairs and began heading downstairs. To get to the basement, you had to go outside into cellar-like doors. So we get into the basement and found the tricycle that was explained to be haunted and apparently rolls around in the middle of the night, but nothing else. We searched all the rooms, and it was only one room with a water heater in a corner, but found nothing. We all began to just talk in the basement, make small talk, and this is when the most unexplainable thing happened. Suddenly, we heard a sound like change hitting the floor above us. Not a few coins, but a handful. A few seconds of silence and bam! Out of nowhere this huge bang appears. Everyone screams and runs out the room except for me and an older gentleman. I presume it was the grandfather of the kids we met. We look at each other and say, "What the hell?" And everyone proceeds upstairs when we go to the room right above where we were. The tour guide and several other people on the tour were in this room. Now mind you, this room was the exhibit room where there were show glass cases and bookshelves. A bang as loud as the one that had happened would have knocked some stuff over. We asked the tour guide and the other people on the tour if they heard change falling on the ground, preceded by a large bang. They told us they hadn't heard anything. To this day I have no clue what happened, causing me to believe that the house may in fact be haunted. I lived in a house that was made in 1930. My grandfather died in that very home, and we lived there for about 7 years. It was in first grade when I was doing my homework when I heard something fall from the fridge. A pack of pills fell off it. I checked the top of the fridge to see where it fell from and realized it was from the back, so I continued my homework in fear. On another occasion, I was in the living room playing my favorite game, Motocross Madness. My cousins were over at the time and started panicking and looking over at my bedroom door. My brother went to see what they were talking about and saw a shadowy figure closing the door, and everyone had trouble sleeping that night. In 2013, as a university student, I lived in an oldish tenement flat in Glasgow that was probably around 250 years old, which is pretty common over here. It was dusty, cold flat with high ceilings, 4 bedrooms of which I had the largest. Things started normally enough until one night after my flatmate's birthday party, we had used my room to host it, and someone had made a cake. We hadn't finished it and left it wrapped in tinfoil on my table. As I was trying to sleep, I could hear the tinfoil rustling. I got up in case it was a rat, but there was nothing. I left the lamp on and tried to sleep. I heard more rustling, so I sat up in my bed and saw the tinfoil around the cake open. My heart pounding, I picked it up and put it in the kitchen. Feeling a bit spooked, I went to bed and slept. Over the next few days and weeks, I certainly noticed more banging, but it was an old flat, so it could have just been old noisy pipes. Then, one day, me and my flatmate came home from uni. He was busting for the toilet, but it was locked. We banged on the door, but no one answered. Turns out it was locked from the inside, but no one was in there. We had to phone the landlord to get permission to break the lock. They fixed it the next day, and the same thing happened 2 weeks later. Then one night I got up to use the toilet and shower that was running on full blast. I started thinking that something spooky was going on. One of my flatmates, Adam, agreed. The other two, the science students, disagreed. Then one afternoon I was laying in bed, texting, and a pound coin fell from what must have been the ceiling and bounced off my chest. It freaked me out and I left the room. The next day one fell again from where seemed to be the ceiling when I was in the shower. I told my flatmates, and the same thing had happened to Lewis when he was sitting on his desk studying. It was quiet for a few weeks until one night at around 2 a.m, a banging on my wall woke me up. Only me and Lewis were in the flat. The other two were back home for the holidays. I went through the hallway to see if anything there was causing the banging and met Lewis, who'd also woken up. The kitchen door then slammed shut with so much force that we panicked. Each got a knife from the drawer and slept in the same bed with the light on. Next day we phoned a minister, who said he didn't really deal in that sort of stuff but to burn sage and open all the windows. I have to say it worked. The flat always felt creepy, but at least nothing paranormal happened after. When I was 14, my older brother and I decided to go on holiday to visit our dad for a week. Our family was friends with this family, who used to live very poor and didn't own a lot. However, it turned out some relatives of theirs had passed away, and they now inherited this huge house. The house was kind of hidden on a mountain in some woods, but it was very beautiful with a large pool, and we were happy for them because they were usually very poor. So our plan was to spend a week at their house and help them renovate. They didn't have enough beds, so I had to share a bed with 2 of their children. One was my age and the other was 7. During the day there was no problem at all. We were really enjoying it and everything seemed perfect. But at night there were some really scary things that happened. We all had nightmares all the time, and it seemed as if you couldn't wake up until sunrise. I've had some problems falling asleep when I'm in a new place, and I witnessed some disturbing things. Like one night, the 7-year-old got up and screamed, "Mummy!" 3 times and went back to bed and kept sleeping. Or the other kid once fell out of the bed onto a large pile of Lego. You can probably imagine just how much that hurt, but he kept on sleeping and I had to pick him up and put him in bed. But the most unsettling thing was when I got up in the morning and my brother saw that I had 3 deep scratches on my back, which have now turned into scars. I never felt or noticed anything. We found out that the family also didn't have a good relationship with their relatives and didn't seem to mind their passing. A few weeks ago, my dad told me that after much consideration, they in fact sold the house. My dad is a reverend, and we live in a rectory. We found out a bit after we had moved that it was built on an old graveyard. There would be times that I would be in my room and would hear footsteps coming down the hallway very late at night. But when I would stick my head out, nobody would be there. However, as soon as I would close the door, I could hear them again. I'm a teen mum, so that's why I live with my parents and siblings. But there would be times only me and my son would be home alone. Bear in mind he's 8 months old, and that's when the paranormal activity mostly happened. Like how I would go downstairs from my room, and there would be paper and books flying at us off the shelves. There would also be so many times when my mum's guitar would randomly start playing when we were sitting near it. Sometimes the TV would turn on by itself. One of the scariest things I will always remember are one day when my siblings and parents were out, my auntie took my son out. So I was in my room reading a book and went downstairs to grab a glass of water when suddenly the TV turned on. When it did so, the volume went to max and the words, "You are not alone," sounded throughout the house. I tried to run out the house, but the door was locked, and the key was not by the door, which is in itself strange, since we would always leave the key beside the door on the table. I ended up running through the back door, but as I was running I could see the figure of a person behind me through the reflection in the window, and I ended up getting out through that. I also remember one time I was changing my son and had a lot of glass smashed downstairs. We were alone at this time as well. When I went downstairs, I brought my kamugi stick with me in case it was an intruder, but when I went downstairs there was no one. There was glass all over the living room floor, but no windows were smashed or anything, it just kind of appeared. Another night my bedroom door flung open and I grabbed my son and ran to my eldest brother's room, and when I brought it up at breakfast the next morning, everyone denied having anything to do with it. Later that night a bloody knife was left outside my door. I checked the hallway and there was a trail of blood. I ran straight to my brother's room, but when we went back it was gone. The next morning my son was covered in blood crying, but he didn't have any cuts. There are many other stories like this. We still live in the house, but I don't often stay alone. They were the incidences that scared me the most. I grew up in Massachusetts, and when I was 10 my family bought a very large 20-plus room house in Brookline, a suburb of Boston. My family was rich, but not like super classy, old money rich. My dad owned a business basically supplying seconds to stores like Christmas tree shops, etc. At any rate, the house my parents bought was really old and owned by a pretty well-known family in Boston who owned an oil company. We didn't move into the house for 2 years because of my mother's renovations. When we finally arrived, several strange things happened. My room was on the second floor directly under the third floor room, and I used to hear odd music and stomping from upstairs. Once I even opened my door and yelled, "Stop!" and the noise did stop. I learned years later that that room had been a servant's quarter. Glasses used to break on their own all the time. Cups would just shatter on the kitchen counter without being touched. I was once walking down the hallway on the third floor when I felt a hand touch my shoulder and try to forcibly turn me around. I remember feeling terrified and knowing in my gut that I really didn't want to see what was behind me. I screamed and ran. It was the scariest moment of my entire life. This happened around 10 years ago in the interior of British Columbia, Canada. I was at the lake with a few people. I had been swimming, and it was starting to get dark and chilly, so I wanted to change out of my swimsuit. There were no buildings nearby beside an outhouse maybe 100 meters away where everyone was sitting, and no thick tree lines to hide in. Mostly low brush with sparse trees here and there, and I decided to change in the outhouse. We were pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Nobody else is at that half of the lake besides the 6 or so people I'm with. Only one road in and out to that spot. I walk to the outhouse, go in and shut the door. The second I shut and lock it, there are 3 quick hard knocks on the door. I call out, "Hello?" No one answered, so I open the door and look out. No one there. I look around for a minute. Weird. I shut the door again. And again, the second it closes, there are 3 quick, hard raps on the door. I throw the door open, no one there, and I walk down the little steps, walk all the way around the building, get down and look underneath. Back up a bit and look onto the roof, explore the nearby shrubs and look under the steps. I'm not the most superstitious person, but at this point I really wasn't considering something supernatural. I just felt confused. I was still in a wet swimsuit, so I decide to give it another shot. I go back in the outhouse, shut the door, and right away the whole process starts rocking back and forth like several people are working together to move it or something. The cement slabs under my feet were moving up and down. I run out of there, duck under the shrubs and quickly change and then scoot back to everyone by the lake. I asked everyone if they saw anything, if a truck somehow backed onto the outhouse and drove away, and if anyone had felt an earthquake or anything out of the ordinary. Nobody had. No one had moved from the chairs the whole time I was gone. I said what happened after sitting there in stunned silence for 10 minutes or so. Everyone gave me funny looks. Only one person really believed what I was saying, and he was kind of excited and told me some of his ghost stories. I still have no explanation for this one though. My dad rented a house in Colorado while transferring positions in his company. Super cheap rent for a nice house in a nice neighborhood. The backstory he got was the family that lived there just up and moved out of the country for no reason and decided to rent the house out before it was sold. The longer we lived there, the weirder it got. One day I was sitting in the basement and heard someone running down the stairs. No big deal. I'm the oldest of 5, so it wasn't an uncommon thing to hear. I saw a shadow and some blonde hair whip around the corner from where I was sitting. Again, no big deal. My little sister is blonde and the playroom was that way. Well, I go upstairs and was talking to my mum about her and she says, "Oh, she's at so-and-so's house for a sleepover. I took her this morning." Oof, that was creepy. Another time I was talking to my dad in the kitchen about how creepy that was and how it made me feel uneasy. He said perhaps we should have a priest come and bless the house. Right as he said that, flames shot from under our stove and burned his arm pretty good. About a month later, an alarm started going off in the house, but it was coming from the attic. My dad went up there and it was a huge siren that was pointing out of an attic vent to the street. My dad was able to follow the wire all the way through the house to see where it was connected. Inside the playroom, he found a secret bug-out room full of clothes and food, as well as the switch for the alarm. It had been switched to the on side, and there was writing all over the walls about an apocalypse coming and other weird stuff. Not 2 weeks after this happened, the family showed up with a moving truck demanding they get to move back in. Eventually, my dad agreed to break the contract after they paid the down payment on a house and paid for the moving expenses. All around, a really weird time in my life. I grew up in a haunted house, and these are a few of my memorable experiences. One house I lived in, when I was a teenager, had stuff go flying around everywhere. Helium balloons that would be left over from a party would somehow teleport around the house despite having no path of getting ahead of you. It would be in one room on the second floor, then all of a sudden in the laundry room, in the basement, bobbing up and down like it was being tugged on. I was alone there one night and decided to go out, locked the house, and parents were at a boat over an hour drive away. I came home to the dining room chairs stacked up along the other kitchen items in a magnificent way, leaning against a ceiling fan. I would routinely see the lights in the hallway turn on and see feet shadows under my closed door walking back and forth at night, despite hearing both my parents snoring in their room. The worst one was one night I had a few friends over, and I lived in the basement apartment of this house at the time. We heard the doorknob begin to jiggle. Not expecting anyone, I went over and flung the door open to find no one there. This doorknob jiggling just kept happening, and it began to freak us out, and we ignored it. After a while, there was a pounding on all the walls, just going in a circle around us, and my friend decided to leave. I was left alone for the rest of the night hearing footsteps walking up and down the stairs to my basement apartment. Later on, we had a tenant take up that basement apartment, and he would routinely see an old lady just standing there, staring him down. Talk about unnerving. I share a room with my older brother. I'm a girl, and he's a 17-year-old boy, and we've both experienced some pretty strange things in our room. I love horror and anything scary. I own a Chucky doll and a Ouija board, whereas my brother, on the other hand, doesn't enjoy horror as much as I do. Well, this took place around a few months ago, and it didn't really bother me until my brother mentioned something to me. I have to explain. I have a weirdly shaped doorway, so I don't have a door yet. Instead of a door, there is a very thin curtain. So if my room light is off, and I was in my room, and the hallway light was on, and someone just so happened to be on the other side of the curtain, then I would be able to see the figure of them. Now, at around 2:30 a.m., I was in bed scrolling through Twitter, when I got the eerie feeling of someone watching me. I look up from my phone to the door, and I see someone standing there, which is immediately creepy because it's dead silent in my house at the time, and the hallway floors make a lot of noise when you walk down them. So I would have been able to hear if someone was approaching my room. At first, I think it's my mum because sometimes she gets up in the night during that time to go to the bathroom, and usually when she does this, she checks on us. But this person had curly hair, and it couldn't have been anyone in my family. That was in the house, because none of us have curly hair, and no one in my family is that height aside from my mum. I stared at the figure for a long time, and they just stood there for about 10 minutes, doing nothing but staring. What was so creepy about it was that it was like they could see through the curtain, and at me, even though I couldn't see them. After a while, they ended up turning around and walking right into the bathroom that's next to my doorway. Now let me explain myself. Yes, I could have gotten up to see who it was, but I was deathly frightened and glued to the bed. Eventually, I did end up getting up and going into the bathroom to look, because no one had come out of there. Of course, when I went in to check, no one was in there. Nothing had moved, or seemed out of place, so I ended up returning to my room and staying there until the sun was out. Only then did I manage to fall asleep. The next day I did end up telling my parents about it, which my mum says she wasn't up at the time and kind of shrugged it off as a crazy coincidence, or perhaps my mind playing tricks on me. However, my dad was immediately interested, because he said the spare bedroom that is locked and securely nailed shut was suddenly open the next day after I had that experience. A couple of months after this happened, my brother randomly asked me if I had any weird occurrences where I'd seen a figure or heard people calling out to me, which I have experienced before, so of course I told him I had. He then told me he had heard someone calling his name out when he was home alone one day, and he also said that he had been walking out of the bathroom at one point, and the door had aggressively slammed from behind him. He even said he'd been having strange nightmares about a figure he couldn't really see, but he said he could tell it had curly hair, which freaked me out, as that was a detail I had omitted when telling my version of the events. I don't know what this could be. I do believe in ghosts, but do you think it's paranormal? Could we be dealing with something from another world? Let me know what you think, please. I'd love to hear your thoughts. My great-grandma and I were really close. She lived in the countryside, so we could only visit her about once a month. The one time I decided to skip the visitation, she passed the day after. As you can imagine, I was pretty upset at her funeral, so I decided to go for a walk to clear my head a little bit. Mind you, it was nighttime and I wasn't planning on going far, and I didn't want to get lost, when suddenly a young girl showed up in front of me and started running towards the cemetery entrance. I did the most illogical thing and began following her. I swear she was so white she glowed in the dark. My dad saw me running towards there and stopped me to ask me what the hell I thought I was doing, and I pointed to the little girl. He said there was no one else with me, and when I turned around to check, she was gone. I told my parents about what happened on the way back to our house, but they decided grief was making me hallucinate. I forgot about that episode until recently. We went visiting my great-aunt, my great-grandma's kid, and she basically pulled out an old family album. I was going through the photos when I saw the exact same little girl from the cemetery. I asked who that was, and she told me that was her younger sister. She died after an accidental drowning when she was 8. My great-grandma was making dinner when she snuck out to play with some friends and ended up drowning herself by accident at the nearby river. The creepiest part? We have the same name. Mind you, my mum didn't know about this kid until that day, so that was not a tribute or anything. I'm also terrified of water since the day I was born, and I still can't wash my hair without a towel by my side because when the water runs through my face, I feel suffocated. My boyfriend lives in his country's embassy in my country, as his parents are diplomats. He knows that a couple of diplomats killed themselves in that very building. They were found hanging together, and the room where they were found, no one goes to. It's closed for people, because it's super scary and no one wants to sleep on working there. His cat always stares at the hallway. Usually it's dark, and she likes to spend the night in there. The cat always plays on the carpet, like someone is playing with her. One day I was talking to him via phone call, and he asks me to wait a minute. He goes into the kitchen when I hear a woman's voice speaking his first language, which I don't understand. He comes back and I ask him what his mum wants, and he's like, eh? He asked me what I meant when I explained that I heard a woman over the receiver and asked if it was his mum. He said she was out. I was super scared at that point because I clearly heard a voice, like 4 sentences with a calm voice, like she was speaking to someone. It was very scary. I wonder if it's the phantoms of the people who ended their lives there. I was a young kid at the time, probably no older than 5 or 6. This must have happened in the 90s. I remember that in my room I had an old Windows 98 computer, and I had some basic kids games on it, and one of them was called Dinosaur Museum. It was a really simplistic game in which you have several different kinds of dinosaur and you could reskin them in different colors and effects. I think there were a few mini games in there as well. Anyway, when you start playing the game, it would say, "Welcome to the Dinosaur Museum," in a loud announcer's voice. So one night I was playing this game with my parents, and when bedtime came, we turned the computer monitor off and went to sleep. Late into the night, I was woken up by this booming voice saying, "Welcome to the Dinosaur Museum." I look over and somehow the PC had turned itself on and opened the game and was just trying to play itself, and the monitor had turned itself on and everything was on full volume. I was freaked out and went to get my parents, but as I recall, my mum just hushed me, turned it off and went back to sleep. I thought I'd imagined this, but recently I brought it up to my brother and mum, and they both remember it happening too. It's probably one of the strangest things I can remember. One Christmas Eve, I was staying at my uncle's old farmhouse in the middle of the night. I awoke to the sight of an old man looking exactly like the typical Santa. I was so confused and scared, so I kept my eyes closed and eventually fell back asleep. I told my family about this mysterious Santa visit, and to my surprise, no one ridiculed me for thinking I saw Santa. Instead, they determined I was old enough to know the truth about the former owner of the farmhouse. He was a real person who was sadly found dead with suspicious conditions. Turns out my uncle has had plenty of odd occurrences throughout his time living there. Never anything hurtful or violent, but definitely made his presence known. What really sealed the deal was when they showed me a picture of said previous owner, Saul. And what do you know, he had a remarkable resemblance to Santa. Rest in peace, Saul. My wife and I went on a haunted walking tour of the old town in San Juan Capistrano. We enjoyed the spooky stories and the history, but never really took the haunted part too seriously. At a stop at one of the old houses, the tour guide explained the history of the house and how she thought of it as her favorite stop. She said she had experienced the former resident Alice and that she always felt welcome there. She says she has seen shadows crossing the room at night and other times, but never felt threatened. She also said one of her fellow guides liked the house as well, but for the opposite reason. He never felt welcome and always had disturbing feelings at that part of the tour. As we're standing by the front door, the house isn't open to the public. Other people, 2 women on the tour, were asking Alice to show herself and peering into the window through the door. My wife looked on with interest, while I stood back on the patio and leaned against the railing. Nothing happened to them or for them, so they left that area and walked around another side. I stayed for a moment longer looking inside the house from where I stood. It was only then that I felt a gentle pressure on my chest, not like a hand but like a gentle push, accompanied by a tingling sensation all over my body. I also felt the intense compulsion to leave right away, which I did. As I walked around the corner to where the rest of the group was, my wife saw me and must have seen something on my face even in the darkness. I explained the sensation I felt and the tour guide said, "That's Alice." We talked for a bit and wondered why I and the other male tour guide felt that way when most everyone felt welcomed. My wife suggested that perhaps Alice didn't like men. About 6 hours later, or 3 a.m, when we were in bed, I experienced the first night terror I've had in a long time, and the only sleep paralysis episode I've ever experienced. In what felt like a dream, I saw someone come into the room, an adult-sized shadow, move around to my wife's side of the bed and lay down. It was at that time sleep paralysis occurred. I tried to move, I tried to talk, but all I could produce was a gurgling, rapid snoring sound. I was trying to form words, but just made noise. My wife poked me the way she often does when I snored, and I was able to hear in almost raspy words, "Andy, help." It was clear in my head, but I don't know how clear it was to her. What I do know is she woke up and shook me, concerned for my well-being, and that broke the sleep paralysis. I apologized, but did not want to get into details at the time. She drifted back to sleep fairly quickly, and it took me 20 minutes just to calm down before I could even contemplate sleep. I'm a relative skeptic, but that was the first time I've ever experienced anything like that. When I was 13, I was walking home from a friend's house after school. and passed by a girl that appeared to be slightly younger than I was. She was soaking wet and seriously upset, so I asked her what was wrong and she ignored me. I got home to my father warning me about going near the lakes, because a 10-year-old girl had just drowned in them the day before. The first of many ghosts that have made their presence known to me. When I was 23 and in the army barracks, I lived in the haunted ones. I had the gist of one girl waking me up in the middle of the night by opening my door and letting the light in. When I woke up and asked who the hell they were, they screamed and slammed the door. I ran out to catch up with her because females aren't allowed in the barracks past curfew, and there was no one in the hall. The staff sergeant that was on duty asked me what the hell I was screaming and slamming doors for. Obviously, I had to apologize and close my door and tried to sleep. One of the other ones was a native Alaskan, and that's all I'll say about him. I had a stepsister who was mentally handicapped. She was always smiling and in a great mood. Her window looked right outside into our backyard, and she would always wave and smile at me when I was out there. A little background info: our house got struck by lightning during a huge storm, and after that the vibe always felt off. My sister and mum had reported hearing and seeing things multiple times, though my sister thought at the time she may have been hallucinating. She saw a girl standing over the rotunda and looking down at her in the middle of the night. My mum had said that she saw the same girl and described them perfectly in unison. My sister no longer thought it was a hallucination. Together we also heard footsteps upstairs when we were home alone. I was about 11 at the time, so I was kind of oblivious and didn't know what to think. I still don't. I was out back playing with my dog and throwing the ball around one day, when suddenly he freezes and starts growling at her window. He's never growled at her before, but I think maybe he was just surprised to see her. That's when I look up at the window and saw her standing there with a blank, but also angry look on her face. She usually has her headphones in and would be swaying or dancing, and her tablet was right in front of her, so again I passed it off as nothing. I wave at her, as I always did, but she looks me dead into the eyes. They looked so dark. She started breathing really heavy. I walked as close to the glass as possible. She looked different. Her entire complexion seemed darker, and her mood was something else entirely. I decided to head inside and check on her upstairs. I knocked and walked into her room, and she was laying in her bed, headphones on, listening to music. I asked if she was alright, and she seemed really confused. She said she was perfectly fine and asked why. I told her that she looked a little sick at the window. She looked at me with her happy face and said, "I didn't go to the window, silly." I can't forget those words. That was when I started to get confused. I wasn't scared, just confused, and to this day I have no idea what it was. We moved out of that house and my mum and stepdad got a divorce. My mum always says there were two spirits in that house, the little girl and the older man. When we heard footsteps upstairs, it was just my mum, sister and I living there, and we heard a pair of light, heavy footsteps. My sister and mum seeing the same little girl made my sister believe in ghosts or spirits. I'm still not sure. Normally I'd say no way in hell do ghosts exist, but after this experience, I have no clue. My husband and I shared a house with a friendly but mischievous ghost for a few years, who would randomly turn on electrical appliances around the house, and it didn't matter if they had knobs, buttons, or both. My dad and grandpa were both electricians, and they checked the entire house as well as all appliances and found nothing wrong. But then he turned on the stovetop, and I was livid because of the potential danger. So I shouted out loud to never do it again, and he never did. But he continued messing around with the rest of the appliances. And why do I say he? Well, because 3 people independently gave the same description. Young man, early 20s, light hair, 1940s clothes. The house was built in the 1930s in an area with a lot of World War II resistance activity. But they didn't know that at the time. I have a few stories to share. I lived in a house that is in the Historical Society's website and protected by them. It's an old, super creepy place. I lived there with my ex-boyfriend at the time. I had just moved in with him as he'd lived there for 3 years by himself. Nothing strange other than the feeling of being watched occasionally ever happened to him there. On the first day of living there, I cooked dinner for us and bring our plates into the living room, set them all down and go back to the kitchen for the silverware. And all of the cabinet doors are now open, and I mean all of them. And this is a huge kitchen, so there are about 30 cabinet doors. Unnerving as hell. Well, in this same house at the time, I was 8 months pregnant. Above me is an empty room, and I hear footsteps that are loud, almost stomping, so I just sat there terrified and kept listening. I have had break-ins happen to me as a child, so I assumed it was that. The upstairs door opened and I spun around to face the stairs. Then the same thumping footsteps came running down the stairs, but there was nothing causing them. Nothing was there. And I very quickly waddled outside to my car and cried while waiting for my boyfriend. This next part of the story happened a few years after. Me and my boyfriend, a different guy and now my fiancé, moved into our first house together. For the first month everything was perfect. Nothing weird or creepy or unusual. In the morning, just after unboxing all of this stuff, the electricity would go out in the bedroom at 8 AM on the dot, just in our room. Everything, for 30 seconds and then kick back on. After about a week of this, our kitchen timer started going off all the time too. It was an old type of timer that you had to turn to make it work. It was so loud and creepy that at 8 AM when the lights go out, and no one had even gone to the kitchen yet, it went off. It started to get freaky. Then we noticed that the record player would be moved, opened and turned on, with no music playing, just switched on every morning. We would make sure it was in its spot, closed and off every night, but it kept happening. I tried everything, sage, salt, prayers, talking to the spirit, asking it to leave, but nothing worked. Then one day I realized all of this activity would start as soon as I moved any of my belongings into the home. So I, in a whim, moved all of my childhood stuffed animals outside to the shed, and then everything stopped. No more creepy stuff since, and it's been 3 to 4 months. When I was around 3.5, I had a chest infection, and I told my parents I saw a man in the house. When told to describe him, I said he wore a green dress, had a flat cap, and had dirt under his nails, and that he looked like my dad. So my grandma took some pictures and found out that my great-granddad Jack, who I had never met, fitted the description of the dress being overalls, and it was really weird. I personally don't remember any of it. This was all told to me by all my family, and I was only young and had never even seen him, let alone knew he existed. So to describe him perfectly is still unexplainable to me. This happened in 2009. I was helping a family friend move into their freshman year. My mum, his younger brother and I roamed around campus. We went into the main chapel, where a woman in Victoria-era dress and hairstyle with very pale skin walked past us. We complimented her and said hello, on what we thought at the time was just a costume. But she kept on walking, head straight forward. I followed behind her into the sanctuary, thinking she may have been wearing some headphones that we didn't notice, but no one was there, and we looked everywhere. We are certain she was a ghost, but since then we've been curious. Is the campus haunted? Do others have stories of other sightings? When we told the others what we saw, they thought we were joking, since we said this campus was haunted from the moment we arrived. Me and my brother were home alone one night, because my mother went to the salon with my brother's fiancée. So my brother goes to the kitchen to make something to eat. As he leaves the kitchen, we had this balloon on the table from Valentine's Day 4 days prior. He looks at it and turns around, but there's nothing there. He calls me into the kitchen with him and says, "Hey, look at the balloon." I look and there's a black shadowy figure by the window. There's nothing by the window, but when we look back at the balloon with the shadow, it's still there. My brother's food finishes heating up in the microwave, but the thing is, our microwave always makes 4 beeps to let us know when it's finished. Today, it was silent. I was afraid, so I ran all the way to my room. And now, every day I hear footsteps in the night while I'm trying to sleep, and when I go out to see who's there, there's no one. I still live in this same house. My ma hasn't decided if we should make our house bigger or move to a different one. I insist on staying in our current house because I kinda like the ghost. They haven't broken anything yet. This happened during the COVID lockdown. I was home with my parents as I'd just quit my full-time job and was due to start school in the next few weeks. I woke up at around 10:30 to see what my parents were up to. My dad was out, so I sat down at the table with my mum who was working on it and chatted with her for a bit. After the decline in conversation, I brought my phone out and started scrolling through it. When out of nowhere, this strange white light appeared out of nowhere. A beam of light illuminated down the area of the table where my phone was, and we both looked at each other and of course looked up. The strange thing was, there was absolutely nothing that could have produced this phantom light, and not long after it was there, it was gone. I'd like to give you some context. As I said, it was 10:30 in the morning, and it's impossible that anything could have produced this by itself. No light fixture was on. The windows and the angles mean that nothing like that could have happened, and we still have no idea what the hell caused it. If anyone has any idea what it could have been, I'd be grateful to find out. I was a ride operator at a local theme park, and one night while closing up the ride, one of my co-workers went down to shut the door to the queue. I saw there was a kid with a hat and striped shirt through the security cams running through the line. I called my co-worker over the loudspeaker to let him know that there was a kid left in the queue. He searched all over and didn't spot anyone. There was a point on the security cams that my co-worker was directly near the kid, but he said he didn't see anyone, and eventually the kid never popped up on the cameras again, and there was no sign of him leaving. I'm thankful it happened to be my last week working there, and I never believed in anything like that until that incident. I worked at Disney for a while, back at the stores in California Adventure after Buena Vista Street opened. One night I was cleaning the shelves in Trolley Treats when the locked automatic doors just opened. Now normally I wouldn't think anything of it, but two fellow cast members behind me checking out registers just stopped and stared. I asked, "Did those just open on their own?" And they both nodded. I shrugged and continued my work. About 10 minutes later, it did it again. This time I was alone. I got down and checked the door, but it would never open for me, so no idea what caused them this time. I mentioned it to a lead who told me that the whole of Trolley Treat side on the old Burbank ice cream shop were haunted by a little girl who died in the parking lot, back when DCA wasn't even a dream. She apparently likes messing with the boys and would tease male leads closing up by running up and down the aisles late at night. A room in my parents' house has a ghost of the toilet, we mockingly call it. It's not aggressive or anything, it just does benign things in our central bathroom, which was connected to my room. Even a couple of times it has opened the cabinet, the towels for me after a shower. Honestly, I think it just wants me to shower because every now and again it would turn on the shower when I entered the bathroom. Whoever the ghost is, it's honestly a little flattering, but has no regards for my parents' water bill. Many of you may have heard of Salisbury Hall and the White Lady. In my whole time working there, I can't say I saw the White Lady per se, but I did have one encounter that I don't think I'll forget. I used to be a cleaner for the small huts that people could stay overnight in, so I never went directly into the hall, only ever walked past it when leaving and entering the grounds. But scary things did happen. I would hear footsteps on the gravel coming towards the hut I was in, but no one was there. I had the occasional knock on the doors and windows, even after hearing faint voices and mumbles, but that became normal after a while. The scary part was when the little girl showed up. I was cleaning one day, and it was chucking it down, so I kept all my stuff inside and only went out when moving between huts. I heard a very muffled knock at the door, but didn't see anyone out of the window, so wrote it off as just another scary noise. There was a mirror directly across from the door, and when I turned around to face it, it was then that I spotted her. She had fairly pale skin, brunette hair tied up into a ponytail with a ribbon, and an oddly fancy but old-looking dress. It was very common for us to host weddings there, but as far as I was aware, there wasn't one that day nor the next. When I turned to face her again, she was gone. Confused, I carried on with my cleaning, when about 10 minutes later I heard the knock again. This time she was really at the door. I was used to people asking me questions and such, but I didn't know what a child would want really. I opened the door, and she asked if I could help her open the door to a hut across from me. She said her mum was at the cafe, and she forgot to grab the key from her. I wasn't hesitant, as I should have been, because it was only a little girl after all. I walked over with her and let her in. I was confused as there wasn't any luggage in the room. The beds were messy and it was freezing cold with a window left open, but no bags. I assumed she had just got there and her bags were in the car or something. Regardless, she thanked me and I went back across, finished cleaning the room, and pulled up the list I had made on my phone to see what I had to clean that day. Her hut was on the list. I'd never been so confused in my life, so I decided to return to the hut that I'd left the girl in to ask if she got the right one. The window had been closed, and when I pulled the handle, the door was now locked. I peeked through the window and saw the girl wasn't there. I went back into the room, and it was no longer cold, the heating was on, and everything looked as though a family had just left, like it was a regular clean. I never saw the girl again, but I'm almost certain she wasn't human. I don't know what I spoke to that day, but I think it wasn't a little girl. I woke up at 5:30 a.m. and there was a lot of fog, quite dense, so you couldn't see a block away. I decided to walk to the public forest that's close to my house. I wanted to take pictures. I walk a bit in the forest, and while walking into a path that leads to a crossroad, where there is the cross of a taxi driver that was killed 15 years ago, there is a little hill on the left-hand side of the path, which I could see well, only in a greyish-blue hue because of the fog. Suddenly I felt someone watching me. I then turned my head to the left and saw about 70 meters. It was a dense, foggy figure, and quite a shape of a dad bod, with not really noticeable features, but I could see that they were sitting, as then after they stood up. It was like when you see a man that was raising up, holding their ball joint to help them stand up, and he turned away like he was going to walk in the same direction, gave one step, and then vanished into thin air. I reached the cross path where the cross lies, and the cross was down, and the concrete looked like someone had pushed it over. I felt that I should raise it up again, but it looked quite heavy, and I felt lazy. I wondered if the spirit of the taxi driver was leading me to his cross to help me raise it up. It didn't feel evil or mean. It was a calm moment. I actually felt calm too myself. I don't do drugs or have a mental disorder or anything like that. It didn't feel evil or mean or anything. I think it was just a ghost that didn't want to be forgotten. I live in a pretty small apartment. It's part of an old complex that had been handed down for generations until the family had sold it. I live with my boyfriend, but before he moved in with me, I swear I could always see the same figure in the reflections of my mirror, like a woman in one of these old fleece nightgowns. I used to write it off as paranoia of living alone, but after my boyfriend moved in, he'd keep telling me he'd seen something around the place, as I'd never told him I had before. Nothing bad nor aggressive ever happened, just small things like shampoo bottles being moved or falling over without reason, stuff taking a tumble off the counter even though it was in the middle of the bench, windows closed, with none of us in the room. We were always two ways about whether we had a spirit attached to the apartment, until I had a friend stay over at ours for a few weeks. We didn't say anything about it to her because it never came up until she told me she thought she was seeing things move in the reflection of the mirrors. She isn't really into the paranormal, so from my point of view it was interesting for her to bring it up. I just think that if the spirit isn't doing anything aggressive or such, I'm fine with it being attached to my unit. I only got really creeped out for the first time the other day when I was sitting in front of my couch watching TV, when my eyes instinctively looked at the mirror and I swear I saw her, the spirit, sitting on the couch behind me, almost like she was watching the TV too. I kept trying to tell myself she's friendly and obviously doesn't mean any harm, and it got me wondering if anyone else has experienced a benevolent ghost. Me, my mum, my aunt and my uncle all used to live in this really crappy run-down apartment building. To give you an idea, the roof was nearly damn caving through from mold and was infested with bugs. The landlord did nothing. Both me and my uncle concur that we always felt this weight on our shoulders the entire time we were there, and it worsened when we went into the bathroom, while completely going away outside. The bathroom was the worst part of the place. You know that feeling when someone's watching you all the time? In that room, specifically from the vent, it felt like red eyes, gave me serial killer vibes, but there was nothing in there. I remember being so scared to go in there, and for a long time after moving out, I was just scared of bathrooms. I know it sounds stupid, but it's true. Whatever was there truly terrified me. My uncle said he felt maybe 6 different entities in the house. I used to see exactly 6 shadowy figures at night, darker than the room around them. They wouldn't move, but they were humanoid, and I know what I saw. I had never told these details to anyone. I had never even spoken about the things I'd felt in the house. I'd buried the memories, and I don't want to make them resurface. There was one more thing that absolutely freaked me out. One time I was in my aunt and uncle's room crying. I don't remember why. I stopped for a minute, and the room was completely silent, when all of a sudden I hear a comforting hush. I was a child, and the voice came out of nowhere. As you can expect, that completely terrified me, and I bolted from the room and vowed to never stay there after that. Later in my life, my uncle casually started talking about ghosts. He mentioned before that his grandmother helped him tap into the paranormal, and he's now sensitive to it. His side of the family are 100% believers. When these memories resurfaced, I had to confirm with him to find out if it was just my imagination or if there really was something there. I'm positive there was after comparing notes with him. He gave his experience first, and it matched mine pretty much to a T. I almost wanted to return there and see if any of this still holds true, and partly to see if the building has collapsed yet. I may in future, but I don't think I will anytime soon. I'm a 36-year-old male and live near Atlanta. I'm married and truthfully live a pretty ordinary life. I'm a former Navy law enforcement officer and currently hold a bachelor's in mechanical engineering. I'm also a huge gamer and PC nerd. I haven't been religious since I was 8, and when people ask me what I believe in, I simply reply, I believe in science, and leave it at that. There is another side of me that listens to Alan Watts' Chill Step at night and ponders the deep questions of reality in our universe. But in most day-to-day situations, I'm very logical and usually try to debunk things first. But when logic and science cannot explain something that's happened, that's when you start to really question everything. One of my earliest core memories I have is from when I was 4 years old in 1990. It was when I saw the ghost in my grandparents' house in Florida. I remember my mum sitting on the couch in the living room, talking with both of them, and so I ran off through the house to explore instead of listening to the grown-ups talk. There was a dividing wall that separated the living room, where they were, from another room that my grandparents called the den. That was used for other social visits, when they hosted guests. I was in the back hallway of the house, peeking into the den around the doorframe from the hallway. It's a long rectangular-shaped room with just blank white on the left wall and a row of curtain windows on the long right wall. Mind you, this is broad daylight on a sunny spring day, so there were a lot of bright ambient lights coming in from the windows. And I'll never forget what I saw until the day I die. This old, wrinkly lady, in a Victorian-style dress floating in mid-air in the middle of the room. She was maybe 10 to 15 feet from me, floating about a foot off the ground, looking at the walls, so I was looking at her left side. I'm not an artist and can't draw to save my life, but the image is so clear in my mind I wish I could. Her dress was blue, with the frilly lace around the wrist and the neck area being white. She had silver grey hair pulled back into a bun behind her head, and she was translucent, so I could see her, but I could also see through her. There was a dining room table and about 6 wooden chairs behind her that I could see her through. I also could not see her feet, just the bottom of her dress as it waved slightly in a very ethereal way about a foot off the ground. She turned her head to the left and looked directly at me, which I actually don't remember scaring me at the time. Then she turned her head back to the front and looked upwards and kind of evaporated upwards towards the ceiling and vanished. That is the clearest memory that I have in my entire brain, even more so than other core memories from that young age range. It is crystal clear in my mind's eye. We found out later that my grandfather had originally bought the house from an old man whose wife had died in the house, and he was too old to keep up the land anymore. So we think perhaps I saw her. I'm not really sure. We also realized later that if it was not for the left wall being there, the one the lady was looking at, she would have been looking directly at the back of my mum's head. A bit creepy when you think about it. I work outside by myself on an abandoned building site. The place has 15 buildings, all of them boarded up, and of course empty. On my first night there, I was met with a strange sensation, like I wasn't alone. It was odd because I don't usually feel this way. A few nights ago, I was working on the property, when out of the corner of my eye, I see a sort of grey shape. As I focus my eyes on it, it's still there, sort of smoky. It flew out the side of the property and out of my line of vision. What the hell, I said out loud. And then today, early in the morning, I saw very thick fog that was building up pretty quickly. I left the property and came back to find that the fog was gone. I also noticed the fog was only on the property when I drove off. What do you think is going on here? I used to live in the boonies. Driving home from work one night, I spot a bright light just sitting in place over a patch of wood. I've never seen a light there before, so figured it was just a very tall work light or something. Yeah, that must be it. But by the time I passed, the light was gone. I turned around to make sure it wasn't a light facing in one direction, but there was no light at all. I get home and tell my mum about it, and she says it's the same spot where my sister spotted a similar night a few weeks prior. Then my mother proceeds to tell me that she thinks she saw a ghost at the corner there once, when we first moved to the area. She was driving home from work and saw a lady in a white dress walking at 11 p.m. Turned around to offer a ride and she was gone. This is in the mid-90s and was in the middle of nowhere. I was babysitting my 3-year-old niece by myself. When it was nap time, I ran her a warm bath to help her settle. At a certain moment during that bath, she stood up, looked right behind me towards the door, smiled and waved. I looked behind me and there was no one there. All you could see was a hallway without a line of sight to any windows. I turned back to her and tried to grab her attention by saying her name. She just kept looking past me and smiling, and she went back to playing in the bath for a few moments. Later that night, I told my sister the story, and apparently the twin brother of her current neighbor passed away in this house. I believe there might be a few ghosts in my house. You see, in the middle of the night, my stepdad heard the loudest noise that sounded like all the shelves in our garage falling down. He was wide awake when he heard it, so he ran to the garage anticipating everything broken. He opened the door, only to discover everything was as it should be. Many times throughout childhood, I have had new friends sleep over, and every time a new person spends the night, they'd wake up and have 2 or 3 tiny cuts on their fingers. On another occasion, my stepdad was upstairs and heard a really loud noise, like someone hit the wall super hard. He came downstairs to see the pictures on some of the shelves were across the room. Neither me or my sister heard anything, and we lived downstairs. As a result of all this paranormal activity, me and my parents decided to do a spirit box session, just not in the house, and we actually heard many family members come through that had passed. It was their voices and their names. It definitely made a believer of me. I was helping my parents renovate a house in a tiny town. I'm talking like one grocery store, one stoplight, everyone knows everyone. I was taking an old trail on some public paths which lead into the woods and into a hiking trail which followed a small stream. I heard someone yell out really loud. It sounded really far off. I can't explain it, but out of nowhere, the feeling of safety which I had been enjoying was suddenly gone. There were some houses nearby, but barely anyone, and the sound came from the woods. Then I noticed it was dead silent. No dogs barking, birds, and the wind had ceased. The only sound was from the water in the stream. I felt like I was being watched, and my gut told me to go as I went. As I walked away, I saw something at the edge of the woods. It was by a fallen old tree, but it was definitely not a person, just a weird, shadowy, deformed thing. I ran home and just helped my mum paint. It's not the first time I've had a strange experience in this town. I was 15 and watching TV with my parents' roommate. My parents left via the back door to go Christmas shopping. I then heard the door lock and the car start and drive away. 5 minutes later, the door unlocks and opens. The door was behind me, and I call out, "What did you forget?" to no answer. So I turn around. A large black shadow as tall as the ceiling darts off into the hallway as the door is closing. I 100% thought it was my stepdad pranking us. I just knew he would be in the office, jump out and scare us. We searched the whole house. No one was there. Roommates saw everything. We went to check the door and it was closed and locked. Parents said they did not come back home. If there had not been a witness, I would have thought I was having a psychotic breakdown, and I still can't explain it to this day. When I was around 10, I had all kinds of spooky experiences. Every Christmas, my family on my mum's side would come over for dinner and gift us since we lived in a bigger house at the time. We had a staircase that had a door going halfway up the stairs, and on one day, myself and my older brother decided to try and scare our little cousin by saying there was a ghost that lived up there. Of course, we never experienced anything at all until that day. We were at the bottom of the steps just trying to be scary and freak him out, when almost on cue, all 3 of us looked at the doorknob slowly turn, and the door opened to reveal no one there. Needless to say, we all booked it out of the room as fast as we could. I kinda call it karma for me and my brother. My story gets a little more interesting, as when we finally moved from the house, my parents had a lot of people ask us what it was like to have a haunted house. That experience was the only one that I or any of my family members had there. We were all shocked to be asked by so many people. Oddly enough, we still find it weird that no one said anything about it to us when we lived there, or how they knew it was haunted at all. I have a large black and tan coonhound that loves other dogs, and because he's a scent hound, I don't really let him off lead to play with his buddies. lest he catch a scent and run off. We go about 4 to 6 miles each morning, and some of that walk cuts through a massive green belt. Part of the area has a wide, shady lane that is pretty well travelled, but still partially secluded. There were a couple just within sight of us that had 2 dogs with them, and my dog, of course, was trotting along, hoping I'd move faster to catch them up. We were watching them when a young-looking Alaskan mix charges out of the woods, circles us, and very nearly touches noses with my dog. Then it ran off towards these people. My immediate thought was that this dog must be theirs, until it vanished while we watched. There was no mistaking it. It didn't go back into the wood or even leave our line of sight. It was there and then it wasn't. When I did catch up to the couple with the 2 dogs, I asked them just to be sure if they had a 3rd dog, and they looked at me as if I'd grown a horn from my forehead. I live in a very new apartment, but within the last few months, I've very briefly been experiencing a couple of strange happenings. Every once in a while, I will smell a slightly strong odor, almost like old perfume or cologne, always in the exact same spot where I sit on my couch. It usually lasts between 15 to 20 seconds, and it is the same exact smell each time, and neither I or my fiancé wears any perfume nor cologne. I also swear I've seen something move across the room, like a slight shadow, but when the lights are on. I do have a cat, and at first I thought perhaps it was him because it moved very quickly, but he always is laying next to me when I'm home. I've always been pretty skeptical with these matters, but I'm starting to question myself after these happenings. My fiancée, on the other hand, is very much a believer. Since she's a firm believer in ghosts and such, we talked about trying to communicate if we see it again. Do you think it would be a good idea? My brother and my sister were singing Greensleeves while doing the dishes in the kitchen one summer. The whistle continued the tune for about 5 seconds after we finished singing, and it just vanished. My sister and I can't whistle, and we were all staring at each other while the whistling occurred. My brother and sister immediately checked out for passers-by, as we live in the country with no neighbours, and if there was someone there we would have seen them for sure, not to mention that the whistle was coming from right inside the kitchen. While I covered my ears and started having a panic attack from fear, they check inside the house for someone too. We couldn't explain it and still talk about it to this day. My parents still live there and continue to have odd experiences, but nothing ever to that level. I used to work at a bowling alley / arcade laser tag place. Apparently someone had died there in the laser tag arena just under a year before I started working there. One night we closed the arena for a few hours and I had to clean the area with some other employees. While we were cleaning, both the main lights and the decorative black lights went out, and the whole room was pitch dark. I was on the upper level of the arena when one of the guys behind me screamed at the top of his lungs. I saw that he was somehow barely dangling above the safety rail and yanked his arm back before he fell. He was really freaked out and said that something cold touched his back and pushed him. There have been other occasions where he's been injured or attacked by some unseen force while inside the arena, and we all thought it was the ghost of the guy that died. The employee later quit because he was almost seriously injured inside the cursed arena. I used to be a ghost tour guide in colonial Williamsburg. One night shortly after the holidays, I was leading an extended 10 p.m. tour. We go to one of the stops, and I was telling the story about the history of the location and the activity there, while a few people took pictures. After I was done talking, everyone broke off to take pictures and go see the little family cemetery, when one of my guests came up to me with her phone and said, "I think you should see this." It was a picture of me, and standing right at my shoulder was a large black figure with a smile that I can only describe as demonic. I've never cussed at work before, but then I couldn't stop myself and said, "Oh shit." Then I checked to make sure there were no kids in the vicinity. Naturally though, everyone else on the tour had to come and see. We moved on pretty quickly after that. I was trying to get to bed after a very stressful day. It was my cousin's funeral, who ended their life at the age of 14. As I was laying on my bed with the lights on because I was afraid to sleep in the dark that day, I was still awake when suddenly the door opened and my uncle, who had died a long time ago, entered the room. I didn't see my uncle, but somehow I knew it was him. In the way he breathed, the movement, the manner that I only knew him to have. He sat on the edge of my bed. I wanted to raise my head to look at him, but he pushed my head towards the pillow with his hand. I understood that he didn't want me to see him. I suppose I just ended up falling asleep. But it definitely freaked the hell out of me. Maybe he wanted to just provide me comfort for all the pain I was going through. It was around 10 p.m. I was driving down an industrial road that is linking to a major highway. At an intersection ahead, there was a street light and a guardrail to my right. As I approached, I saw someone balancing on the curb of the road, because with the guardrail and the highway, there was nowhere else for them to walk without being in the road. Just as I started to pass them, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them lose their balance and step out right in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, but like you said, there was not nearly enough time to stop, only to realize no one was there. No one fell in front of the car. The whole encounter took maybe 3 seconds, and looking back on it later, I didn't actually see a person. All I saw was a shadow of a person backlit by a streetlight. When I was 18, one of the jobs I had was working at a Coney Island-style restaurant in my city. The restaurant was open 24/6. We closed 3 a.m. Sunday mornings and reopened 6 a.m. on Monday mornings, but stayed open all the rest of the week. This particular thing happened around 2:30 on Friday. I was the only waitress on shift and the owner was in the kitchen cooking. We were the only 2 people there. At the time, we had a regular called Jerry. Jerry was a barfly and a senior citizen. He would come in every night after the bar closed. He would have a coffee, 2 eggs over easy, and wheat toast. He ordered the same thing every time, and every time his total would come to $4.37. He would always give me $6 and tell me to keep the change. As I'm rolling silverware and waiting for our old pal Jerry, I see a few emergency vehicles go down the main street towards the bar, lights and sirens. About a minute later, Jerry comes in. I get him a coffee and ask him if he knows what's going on. He just shakes his head. So I told my boss Jerry was there, and the boss waved at him through the window, and within 3 minutes Jerry's order was up. He was sitting at the counter, and after a while he slaps down some money and says, "Keep the change, honey," like he usually did, and walks out. I went over to cash out the check, and the food hadn't been touched, neither had the coffee. There was an $100 bill sitting on the counter. I was a teen mum and perpetually broke, so that money was basically life-changing at the time. I saw in the paper on Sunday that Jerry had been involved in a fight at the bar that night and been fatally injured. This happened 12 years ago. I lived on the first floor of a 2-story building which has all kinds of weird ghostly crap going on. My crazy landlord had bought heaps of random crap at estate sales and as such was hoarding it in the basement, which I never went into because it gave me the creeps. I think all the dead people junk is why the place was haunted as hell, but this is my story. I lived here alone for a year before my boyfriend moved in. We had no pets, no children, and I told him a few of the stories and he was skeptical at best. We shared a king bed but had separate covers, and I had recurring nightmares about a boy of 2 with a blonde bowl cut and denim overalls but no shirt underneath and no shoes on. He would stand on the side of my bed and stare at me watching me sleep. I'd wake up in a panic and he would vanish. One night I fell asleep with my feet out of the covers. My boyfriend was sleeping next to me and I feel a very gentle pressure on my left big toe, right where it joins the rest of my foot. I awoke, but I'm absolutely freaked out. It lasted a few minutes and then stopped, and eventually I fell back asleep. Over the next month, this happened a few more times, on different feet here and there. I didn't tell my boyfriend, worried he may laugh at me or think I was crazy. Next time it happened, it went on for a good 15 minutes, and I never had the nerve to look down and see what the hell was holding my foot. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Hey, please let go of my toe." And slowly the pressure left, and I went back to sleep. I sucked up the courage and told my boyfriend the next day, who neither laughed nor called me crazy. He shrugged and said, "Okay, I know about your nightmare, and something's going on. Next time it happens, wake me up and I'll look down for you." Okay, great. So a week or two went by with no foot touching. I hoped it was over, but nope. One night I felt it again. I tapped my boyfriend and he opened his eyes. He was awake. I said, "Boo, he's got my foot, look down for me." My boyfriend nodded but didn't look down. He just stared to me and whispered, "I feel him too and I'm not looking either." From then on he believed me when crazy stuff happened in the apartment, and we've been married for 10 years now. I used to teach in the evenings in Japan about 5 years ago. I often met students at different temples and shrines because people use the rooms as their community spaces for things like that. It was around 11:30 p.m, and I had just had my last English lesson with a student. After she left, it was my job to vacuum the room that I had used and turn off all the lights. So I went into the room with a vacuum, and there were dozens of decorated drums and portable shrines I'd never seen before that were being stored there as the festival was coming up. I opened the door and I could see these moving a little, but figured it was from the vibrations of me opening the sliding door and went around my business. I usually try not to think about creepy things and just ignore if something like this happens. I turn out all the lights before vacuuming and bringing back the vacuum, except the last one by the entrance, then went to the storage room again to put the vacuum back. As I open the door to the storage room, the big drum starts booming in a rhythm super loud, and the portable shrines were all making noise too with their little drums on them. My senses become overwhelmed, and I was afraid to look, so I fled from the building and ran to my car, only to remember I hadn't looked up. I didn't want to be fired, so I had to call my husband and was on speakerphone with him the entire time that I ran back to the temple and locked the door with shaking fingers, and I could still hear the drums from the outside. Luckily, I made it out all right, but I feel like something was messing with me. Since then, people asked me if I ever saw any ghosts at temples because in Japan they believe ghosts come out of temples at night, but I never told them and just said no. I'm pretty sure it wasn't an earthquake or something that caused it because the drums were making noise as if they were being hit rather than just rattling. It also didn't feel like an earthquake. When I was 6, we moved next to my father's parents' house. Suddenly, my mum saw me talking to something that wasn't there. She didn't pay that much attention since she thought it was just the imaginary friend phase. A few days after, my friendship started to freak my mum out, as I started asking why my friend was always sad and why he was allowed to stand next to the stove when I wasn't. She then tries to explain to me that he's just imaginary. "He lives under the sink," I said. My mum told me that I could tell her the exact actions and emotions of this boy. She struggled to make me understand that he wasn't real, and she thought it was just a phase until my grandfather said he found a boy sitting at the backyard door. He was sitting there in the middle of the night. When he asked if he was okay, the boy said he was waiting for his mum and he couldn't leave. My grandpa called his wife, and when she came out, the boy wasn't there. My grandparents said that whenever they were outside to take the trash out at night, they could see the boy sitting in the backyard for a few minutes before he would just vanish. My grandma was an exceedingly punctual person and very serious about respecting people's time. She also had a very distinctive smoker's cackle. When she was 70-something, Grandma had a stroke and died in her sleep. 2 days later, my aunt had plans to meet Grandma up for lunch, but instead my aunt was sitting at home grieving. The phone rang, and when my aunt answered, she heard my grandma's voice say, "Sorry kiddo, not gonna make it today or any other day." Then she cackled like she always did and hung up. I think it gave my aunt a nice last laugh. Anyway, my uncle said her face lit up a bit when she heard her mum's voice. This happened about 7 years ago. I was hanging out after a Boy Scout meeting with one of my friends. It had been an hour or so after the meeting ended, and our parents were talking, so we knew we were going to be stuck there for a while. It was about dusk, shortly after the streetlights had turned on, and we were sitting on a bench facing the road, probably talking about Skyrim or something, when he nudged me and gestured down the road from us, standing on the corner just spaced out and looking at the road. I don't remember specifically what she looked like, just that she was wearing a white dress with long hair and looked about 5 to 7. My friend and I shared a confused glance, fully aware that this was an absurd scenario and wondering what was going on. If this wasn't enough, a car drove around the corner in front of her as though she wasn't there, and sure enough, when the car had passed, she was gone. We both got up and ran to see where she went. Yes, we would die if we were in a horror movie. Of course, she wasn't anywhere to be seen. I don't believe in ghosts, but coming from a religious background, I do believe in demons. I attribute this to a demon messing with us and knowing that by just leaving us hanging, it would bother us forever. My stepdad lived in a house on his own. He always felt a weird energy about that house, and it kind of freaked him out. This was back when the norm for TV was the big box kind that collects dust on the screen super easy. One day he woke up and found a drawing made in the dust of the TV screen. It was the painting of a farmer and his wife, the one where he's sitting and the wife is holding the pitchfork. Another time in the same house, he opened his sock drawer to find his socks had been arranged to look like Snoopy. It's crazy because of all weird stuff that happens, it's always seemingly just to mess with us, but never anything malignant nor harmful. When I was a kid, I lived in a neighborhood that had an abandoned house right next to the one I lived in. There was never anything scary about it at all. When my ball would go over the fence, I'd simply hop over and retrieve it. And I never felt anything wrong with the house. I lived there for 13 years and no one ever moved there. I was playing in the backyard one day when this kid that looked around my age popped out of the house's back door and greeted me by saying my full name, middle name and all. I froze and felt an intense chill down my entire body. He went back inside right after, and I never saw him or anyone leave that house again. This happened 2 years ago. It was 10 o'clock at night and I was in bed. I was on my phone just scrolling through TikTok when from the corner of my eye I saw this messed up figure. She looked like Momo, but bald with patches of blonde hair, her eyes wide and bloodshot. Her body appeared twisted and broken with her mouth sliced open as a smile. I was horrified. I had to look back a few times and my lights started to flicker. My room warmed up and I began to sweat. The entity came closer and I hid under the covers and I couldn't breathe. She came closer and I felt her breathing on me. It was odd. She started to make gargling noises and she brushed her hand onto my blanket. I started to cover my mouth to stop me from breathing too hard. Then everything went quiet. I got up and she was gone. Never to be seen again. What the hell just happened? I was playing with the stick in the backyard and told myself I could beat the devil's ass with my stick sword. I was 7 at the time. Then out of the random junk in the backyard, an arm started stretching out and groaning started. It was mumbling and it sounded like the voice of a really old person in pain. Since I wasn't a complete idiot by 7-year-old standards, I ran into the house as quickly as I could. Turns out the bookshelf was from a yard sale of someone who died. The arm manifesting itself was the same as the bookshelf. My parents, being superstitious Hispanics, took the bookshelf to the dump, not allowing the negative energy into our home. They then said a rosary for a week and sprinkled holy water in the backyard, and it never happened again. My parents, knowing I wasn't a liar, thankfully believed me. What happened made no sense, but I'm sure it was tied to the passing of the person. I'm not sure if I'd have stayed what would have happened, but I don't think I wanted to find out. I used to live in Williston, North Dakota, and there was this bookstore/library that I always liked to go with my mom and sister, who was in high school at the time. I was around 6 to 8, and my mum and sister were in a downstairs area or something, and I thought I was down there with them, because they saw a little boy out of the corner of their eye, but when they turned to look at me I was gone, so they quickly found me and got the hell out of the bookstore. Apparently a few years later the bookstore burnt down and the reason is unknown, but part of me thinks that it was that strange ghost boy. This happened at my grandparents' house in Pasadena. Sometime after my grandpa died, I was with my parents, my grandma and my aunt, and my grandma's housekeeper and his wife. We were all outside, and by all I mean me, my mum, my aunt and the housekeeper and his wife was inside. I'm not exactly sure what she was doing, but she saw a tall, dark figure like a shadow at the top of the staircase that led to the bedrooms. Keep in mind she was the only one inside the house at the time. She got so freaked out she left the house and refused to ever go back in. She literally wouldn't step foot in it. To this day, no one is sure what she saw, if it was my grandpa or someone else. An older man died in our house. I'm a medium and try and communicate with them. Presumably he died of old age, but we were never really sure. Sure enough, footsteps could be heard coming from upstairs, whispers would occasionally happen, and things were misplaced in randomly seeming areas. The one incident that really confirmed this place was haunted was something not a lot of people believe in when I tell them. This old man literally swung open all of our kitchen cabinets and drawers, Paranormal Activities 2 style. I tried to speak with him on many occasions, but he didn't want to be seen, spoken to or heard. Back in 2019, my dad had died and my siblings and I had split his ashes for each of us to keep. Once I brought him to my new home, my electronics would start going nuts. The most notable one I remember is my ceiling fan light, constantly flickering, and it got on my nerves very fast. My older sister said she was experiencing the same events, so we knew this wasn't a coincidence. I raised my voice and said something along the lines of, "Dad, if you're here, could you please stop messing with my stuff? Give me another sign." That same night, while I was home alone, I had a knock twice on my bedroom door, and it was hard to sleep after that. I used to manage a golf course, and one night, as I was helping the cook and waitress close the restaurant side so that we could all go home, I look up and see this kid tucked in the corner of the stairs peeking out at us. The stairs were in the shape of a sideways 7, and I immediately think, there's a kid in here who's forgotten and lost. So I run up the stairs which lead to my office/loft break area, and I look everywhere but couldn't find the kid. A month later, I'm filling in for the cook who called in sick, and I'm the only one in the building as the pro shop lady went to put carts away and the waitress was outside cleaning a table. I leaned back against the window so I could see if anyone walked in the front door, and right away I hear a tap 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 come from behind me. I whip around to see only bushes and trees, and I run outside to see no one. Then I go to my office and check the cameras to see if a ball possibly hit the window so that I could see where the sound came from. Nothing. I showed the waitress the footage, so she knew why I was acting all crazy, and she was baffled. I've never been so relieved to quit a job in all my life. More than 30 years ago, the first time our whole family left the family home in London, we went away together for the week of Christmas down to Devon. We left 2 guys, Jack and Niles, who were both 18 and friends with each other, to look after our house. The usual stuff, feed the cats, pick up the post. So the second day we're away, we get this terrible phone call. They're just babbling, panicked and hysterical, saying that they will never go back into the house. We asked them for a bit more information, and the story goes like this. So they had fed the cats and were sitting down on the sofa watching some comedy for a little bit before heading back. when Niles leapt up suddenly and dramatically grabbed the back of his own neck and was reaching around his own ribs, yelling to get it off. Really panicked, Jack held his arms and shouted, What's the matter?" Niles just kept shouting, "Get it off me! Get him off me!" Niles raced out the house, still attacking his own back. Jack followed, confused and scared witless. Niles continued his fight, rolling around on the pavement of the road as if grappling with an invisible assailant. There was nobody or anything to be seen. The attack finally stopped and they both rode their motorbikes back home and made the call to us that they were never returning. Niles was so scared by the whole bizarre thing that he looked terrible for many weeks and was jumpy. He lost weight and was hollow-eyed before he decided in desperation to go visit a priest, despite not being religious in the slightest, and got a vial of holy water, which he insisted my sister use around the family house to rid the bad force and spirit of evil. Niles did eventually return to the house, but would not come in or stay in any room without being within hand's reach of a family member, including to use the toilet. Niles said he was sure the ghost had been enraged and angry because no family member was there for Christmas. His jumpiness and haunted look stays with me. I bought an older house from a friend. It was his mum's and I bought it when she moved on to another reality. She was a practicing Wiccan and an amazing artist, especially working with clay. She made all the tiles from my hearth and all the pulls on the drawers and cabinets. She was an awesome lady. When she was just getting ready to move on, we were going there every day to clean, having floors laid, etc. Every morning we would go to the house and we made sure it was all locked up tight when we left the night before, and all the lights and fans would be on in every room and all the doors open. We changed the locks, same thing. We put locks on every window and sliding glass doors, and it kept happening. We took the doggy door out thinking someone was reaching through and unlocking the door, but there was no change. Finally, I called out to the empty house, called her by her name and asked her to please stop. It didn't, but it happened a lot less. My dog sitter won't stay alone anymore because he kept seeing shadows. The weirdest thing is my dog started digging up little clay figures. We had 30 or 40 of them, and my friend told me to bury them back. We did, and things seemed to be better. I was driving with my mother on a rural highway through central Illinois, Edgar County, Paris, Illinois, near the Indiana border. It was the middle of nowhere and late at night. As she's driving, and I was probably around 20 at the time, it was foggy. When I see light dancing off the fog, it looked like a group of people walking across the highway, as if my mum's headlights were shining through their moving legs. I didn't say anything to my mum, but she saw something too, and slowed to a stop, but there was nothing there. And as we were stopped, I looked to the side of the highway, and there was a cemetery, one of those small rural ones, right next to the highway. Do you think it could have been related? I was a freshman in high school, staying at UC Berkeley for a summer academic program. I shared a dorm room with 2 other girls in an old building. There was a single bed on one side of the room, a tiny window, a tiny desk in the middle, and a bunk bed on the other side. The 3 girls I roomed with were in very different sections of the program, so we were never together. I had come into the room late, used my phone light to get my stuff down, and turned it off quietly and climbed into my bunk at the top. I shut my eyes and fell asleep for what felt like hours. I woke up to the girl on the other side of the room calling my name. I rolled over and hissed, "What?" Her voice shook as she said, "There's someone in here with us. I saw them come in and rummage through our things." I instantly went from sleepy to alert, but was still confused. The girl starts saying things like, "Please don't hurt us, just take what you want and leave," over and over. The intruder said nothing. At this point my heart was pounding, and I'm too scared to even look off the side of the bunk. The girl starts crying, and the roommate beneath me is now awake. My fight or flight is kicking hard, so I slid between the wall and the bed down to the bunk beneath me. I had my phone, but I had no service. The other girl had no service. We tried frantically to see if we could look up a phone number for security, but we got nothing. The girl across the room is still begging and pleading with the intruder. I tell her to get her ass to our side and sprint over the desk and to our bunk. I grab her and ask, "Where is he? Is he in the closet?" She says she doesn't know, but she knows he's in there. I look around, but it's too dark to tell. Fear is starting to take over. I tell the girls that I'll run and turn on the light switch near the door. We outnumber him and take him on. They are all too shaky to agree, but I'm about to leave these girls because they're paralyzed with fear. I tell them that I'll run and hold the door open and they can sprint out. It was more like a movie because one of the girls goes, "No, I won't let that happen. If we run together." So we link arms and sprint at the door at full speed, make it out into the hall and barrel down to where the leaders of the program slept. Later, security was called and the room was checked. No one was there. Maybe they escaped. We were all so shaken up that we ended up changing dorms, and for a few years I thought that I had barely escaped from death or rape. But eventually, I came to the realization that none of it was real. The figure my roommate saw come into the room was me. She had assumed I was already in the room sleeping. She didn't see me climb into bed because of the angle, and me shutting off my phone. The three of us had thought we were going to die. And it was me. I guess I had lain down and fallen asleep instantly. I laugh so hard when I think about it now, but for years it was the creepiest experience of my life. I've been waking up in the middle of the night to 3 knocks on my wall. I live alone with my cats. My cats sleep in bed with me, so I know it wasn't them. It always happens between 2 and 3:30 a.m. At this time my cats are going nuts, hissing at air. I've checked for any rodents and haven't found any, and I've also seen a large dog-like shadow in the corner of my room one night. I turned my lamp on, and nothing was there. My kitchen cabinets will be left open every Thursday, specifically Thursday, and I wake up in the morning and there they are, open in all their glory. Last night my cats were growling in a fighting position at absolutely nothing, so I turned the hallway light on and started looking, and the hallway light blew, literally exploded. I'm currently staying at my sister's because I'm too scared to stay in my own home. I'm frightened and don't know what to do or what this could be. I've been living in my home for almost a year now, and nothing has happened until this point, and I don't know what to do. I'm an atheist and don't really believe in ghosts. However, I do believe people leave a lasting impact in the world which is felt. I woke up early this morning and made my way into the living room, to which we have a chair that my grandfather, who passed away and would sit in every day, with a picture of him on the pillow. I missed him a lot too, which I almost began to cry with. He was a huge mentor to me, and I still followed his advice to this day. I had a really strong urge to reach out and touch the pillow, to which every single light in the house started to rapidly flicker, like the power was going to go out. My body felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Now it could just be a coincidence, which it probably is, but I like to speculate on what it could mean even if it was a ghost. Every time one of our family members was happy or achieved something, our grandfather would always give them a thumbs up and smile. And that is how I interpreted this that day. This story starts in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I grew up in this state. This place has always had more than its fair share of spooky stuff, from Roswell to Route 666. It wouldn't be hard to find someone who had an encounter of sorts. Growing up, I lived with my mother and my babysitter in a place called the South Valley. The reason for this and the subsequent events that followed are another horror story unto itself. The babysitter had her 2 adult kids and 3 grandkids there too. One of them was called Dustin. Now this guy was a metalhead in all senses of the word. We're talking 80s Iron Maiden Metallica, and all the big names are fresh to the scene. Bullying and fights for being a metalhead were an everyday occurrence for this dude. This may seem unimportant, but this dude wasn't scared of anything, and I was around 11 at the time. We'd go out to get food from the local fast food joint nearby, regularly, and our road went right over an old mud arroyo, or ditch, that you could continue straight or walk along the dirt path beside it. This path would lead you to the back side of a Burger King and beside the landlord's house. Unless we really wanted Burger King, we would avoid this route for 2 reasons. 1, because the landlord was always watching out of his window, and 2, due to there being a small irrigation bridge for the family down the road, you could walk on the bridge if you needed to. It was just put 1 foot in front of the other while holding onto the handrail, kind of. But if you'd slip, you'd fall in. Well, one night we wanted Burger King, so we went. It was 9:40 p.m. He wanted to go at closing because they'd hook us up with more food. With him being my senior of 7 years, I figured he knew what was best. We got our food, 2 bags each, and decided to go back via the bridge since the path was shorter. Now in the valley, we'd get blue moons, a full moon that made the whole place look a bit blue. That night was one. Dustin crossed first, then me. He was about 5 feet ahead of me. We heard something splash, and he turned to look. It was known to be a rough area, and he figured he'd seen someone behind me or was going to mug us or something. I hurry, and my foot slips in the water. I regain myself and get onto the dirt path, running to catch him up. I'm about where he was initially when I turn back to look, and all I can see are bright white lights on the bridge. Now, I know it's not a bicycle, nor can someone with a flashlight be too steady and fast. My turn to drop food and run like hell. I catch up to Dustin and we get inside the house. I dive on the couch in the living room and he goes to his room. When 10 minutes later there's a pounding on the door. I'm freaking out. The oldest kid goes to answer it. It's the landlord, Ray, standing there in his underwear, angry as can be. He swears that Dustin was looking in his bedroom window. He knows it was him because the person had long hair, and he goes on to say he was holding a flashlight to illuminate himself so that he could try and scare Ray and his wife by moaning and crying. Ryan, oldest kid, said he'll deal with it, closed the door and asked what the hell we did. I tried to explain. He just said, "Ditch witch La Llorona was after you," and I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Never walked on that bridge again. It's 3 a.m. I'm walking my dog and looking at my phone when I see a really small white figure walking ahead of me on the street. I look up, and it looks like a 1 to 2 foot tall person with a white sheet covering them, almost like a ghost costume. It notices that I saw it, and it ran behind a car. I see small legs while it's running. It looks like a tiny human, and I can hear the footfalls. I go behind the car, and there's nothing there. I look around the area, and there's nothing in sight. As for the height, when it ran behind the car, its head was just below the tire of a standard car, a sedan, specifically a Prius. I have no idea what I saw or encountered. I have zero explanation. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I value and appreciate you so much. You mean the world to me. Thank you for joining me this Halloween. If you liked today's video, don't forget to leave a like, drop a comment, and all the good stuff. I do try and reply to all of them. Well done for making it to the end, by the way. This was a very long video, and I hope you enjoyed the ghost stories. I certainly enjoyed producing and narrating this video. If you'd like even more content, you can find more on screen shortly. And a huge thank you, as always, to my members and patrons. You mean the world to me. Thank you, who help make all of this possible. Thank you, guys. I'm going to wrap this up here for now. More content on screen if you want to see it, but if not, thank you so much for watching. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.